Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Lull from Scary Stories. I'm here to help you relax and drift off to a peaceful sleep. If you enjoy this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's get started. When I was 14, I got a babysitting gig for a 6-year-old boy named Cody. His parents were friendly enough, but their instructions were sparse, almost dismissive. They told me to order pizza for dinner and under no circumstances let Cody into their bedroom. Before leaving, his mother added an offhand comment that made me pause, Cody'n a bit different. Don't be alarmed if he talks to himself or mentions his imaginary friend. She smiled as if it were nothing, but something in her tone stuck with me. The weather outside was dreadful. Rain lashed against the windows in relentless sheets, and the overcast sky turned the afternoon into an eerie twilight. Inside, I settled on the couch, flipping through channels until I landed on an old episode of Wipeout. You know, the one with people flailing around on massive obstacle courses. Cody, meanwhile, sprawled on the living room floor, his toys scattered haphazardly around him. At first, I thought nothing of the way Cody played. He moved his action figures across the carpet, mumbling softly, occasionally giggling to himself. Then I started noticing patterns in his murmurs. He kept using the name Agnes. At one point, he even paused, tilted his head as though listening to someone, and nodded earnestly. I chuckled nervously. Hey, Cody, who Agnes? He didn't look up, just pointed to the empty space across from him. She right here, we playing. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was typical kid stuff. Imaginary friends weren't unusual, right? I let it go and focused on the television, but then something happened that made my skin crawl. Across the room, one of Cody's toys, a cube-like contraption with a crank that activated a racing simulation on a tiny screen, suddenly sprang to life. The crank spun, and the screen lit up, displaying the animated race as though someone had deliberately turned it on. I froze. The toy wasn't even near Cody. It sat a good 10 feet away, untouched. Cody, I asked, my voice unsteady. How did that happen? He glanced up at me, his expression annoyingly casual. Agnes is playing with it. A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the toy, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Maybe it was a malfunction, a short circuit, but this thing wasn't battery operated. It required physical effort to work. My hands trembled as I walked over, picked it up, and turned it off. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. Cody continued to play, occasionally murmuring to Agnes, while I kept my eyes glued to the clock. His parents could come home fast enough. Later, as the hour crept closer to their return, I went to the bathroom to wash my face, hoping the cold water would chase away the unease that clung to me. The faucet gurgled as I splashed my face, and for a moment I felt calmer. Then there was a knock at the bathroom door. I sighed, but I'd be out in a second. I called, no response. Wiping my hands on a towel, I opened the door, expecting to find Cody standing there, but the hallway was empty. Cody, I called, stepping out. A soft creak made me whirl around. One of the doors at the far end of the hall, D1 leading to his parents' bedroom, was slowly swinging open. The hinges groaned as it moved, inch by agonizing inch. My heart thudded in my chest. Cody, no answer. I turned off the bathroom light and crept toward the open door. The shadows inside the room seemed darker than they should be, been swallowing the faint light from the hallway. My breath caught as I stepped inside. Cody was sitting on the bed in the far corner, his small frame silhouetted against the gloom. His head was bowed, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Cole," I whispered, my voice barely steady. "What are you doing in here?" He lifted his head slowly, his face eerily blank. "Anda, she wanted to come in." My stomach dropped. "Who? Agnes?" He nodded, then tilted his head as if listening to something just over my shoulder. "She's standing right behind you." I spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Silent, except for the pounding rain outside. "Come on," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. I crossed the room, scooped Cody up, and carried him back to the living room. My hands shook as I set him on the couch and turned on the brightest lamp I could find. For the rest of the night, I didn't let Cody out of my sight. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the lights made my pulse race. When his parents finally walked through the door, I practically bolted for the exit, muttering a quick goodbye. They called me a few weeks later, asking if I do babysit Cody again. I did not even hesitate. "No," I said firmly, hanging up before they could ask why new this day. "I can explain what happened in that house, but sometimes on stormy nights I still hear the sound of that creaking door in my dreams." Every town has its legends, and ours had the haunted house by the edge of the woods. Every October, like clockwork, it sprang to life, drawing thrill seekers from all around. My friends, Rod, James, and Bud, his nickname, and I decided this year we do finally brave it together. The attraction boasted 3 features: the haunted house itself, a sprawling corn maze, and a haunted trail through the woods. It sounded like the perfect combination of adrenaline and fun. The night was crisp, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and dried leaves. The haunted house came first, a high-quality spectacle that delivered its share of frights. Jump scares, eerie whispers, and creepy actors lurking in shadows kept us on edge but laughing. With our nerves tingling, we moved to the next attraction, the corn maze at first. The maze felt like a light-hearted reprieve. The rows of corn stood tall and silent, the paths weaving endlessly ahead. We joked about who do get lost first, walking in easy camaraderie. Then came the scarecrow. He erupted from the stalks, his ragged clothes flapping as he screamed. The sound pierced the still night, and we all screamed back, part fear, part reflex. He started to chase us. Even knowing he was just a performer, panic took over. There is something primal about being chased. I found myself at the back of the group, heart pounding as the scarecrow heavy footsteps closed in. I ran faster, blindly navigating the maze, until I realized I was alone. Somewhere in the chaos, we go all scattered. "Rod, James, Bud," I called into the endless rows of corn. No answer. The maze became a labyrinth of wrong turns and dead ends, my pulse quickening with every moment of solitude. The scarecrow had vanished, but now there was no one. Not my friends, not other visitors, just the rustle of cornstalks swaying ominously in the breeze. Then I heard it. Movement ahead. A shuffle too deliberate to be the wind. I slowed, my breath hitching as I approached. Without warning, a hand shot out from the corn and latched onto my wrist. The grip was like iron, squeezing until I cried out, "Stop! You're hurting me!" I shouted, my voice raw with shock and fear. The figure emerged, a man in a heavy black coat, black jeans, and a blank black face mask. No costume I recognized, no attempt to appear part of the attraction. "What the hell is your problem?" I yelled, wrenching my wrist free. He didn't answer. Instead he lunged. Instinct took over. I turned and sprinted, adrenaline surging as his footsteps pounded behind me. "I'm reporting you," I yelled over my shoulder, not daring to look back. After what felt like forever, I burst through the edge of the maze and into the open an employee stood nearby. I hurried over, breathless, and described the man in the black coat. The employee frowned, clearly unsettled, and promised to investigate. My wrist throbbed as I thanked him and checked my phone. A missed call from James. I called back immediately. "Where are you guys?" "We at the haunted trail." James said, "We could find you." Relieved to hear their voices, I promised to meet them there. The trail entrance was shrouded in fog, eerie music drifting from hidden speakers. I stepped onto the path, the woods closing in around me, but I wasn't alone. There he was, man in the black coat, standing in the middle of the trail. My blood ran cold as he turned to face me. Before I could speak, he charged, full speed. Terror gripped me as I bolted off the path, plunging into the woods. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, hoping to scare him off. My voice sounded hollow against the rustling leaves and snapping twigs. I ran until the only sound was my ragged breathing, the forest silent around me. Collapsing onto the root of a tree, I tried to catch my breath. Had he really followed me from the corn maze? The thought made my skin crawl. Then the crunch of footsteps. My heart stopped. I silenced my phone, praying the noise would pass. It did. Peering around the tree, I saw nothing. But when I stood and started to run again, he appeared, closer this time. "Leave me alone," I screamed. But he didn't stop. He caught up to me, shoving me hard. I hit the ground, stunned, but scrambled to my feet before he could grab me. Felled by pure fear, I sprinted toward the trail entrance. His footsteps faltered, then stopped. I ran straight to the front office, bursting in to demand a manager. Shaking, I recounted everything to the older man behind the desk. He frowned deeply. "But we don't have any actors wearing that costume," he said. My stomach dropped. The manager called the police, and I waited trembling for my friends to join me. When they arrived, I could barely explain what had happened. The police took my report, but without any visible injuries or clear evidence, there was little they could do. The attraction shut down for the night. The festive atmosphere replaced by unease. We drove home in silence. None of us spoke about returning to the haunted attraction the next year. I had been to one since. 2 months ago, I made what I thought was the perfect escape from the city. I purchased a vacation mobile home tucked away in the quiet wilderness of Hudson Valley. It wasn't much, just a small aging shack with 2 cramped bedrooms, a little living room, a kitchen that barely fit the essentials, and a single bathroom. It was far from luxurious, but it felt like freedom. With 2 acres of land, I envisioned it as a peaceful retreat where I could breathe, think, and enjoy the stillness that New York City never seemed to offer the best part. It was only a 10-minute drive from my favorite snowboarding mountain. I imagined spending winters carving through fresh powder and summers hiking trails in solitude. When I first got the keys, my family came with me to help make it livable. We spent a weekend decorating the place, transforming it from a bare-bones structure into something cozy between trips to the local furniture outlets and hauling couches in my dad and pickup truck. We made quick work of the setup. It was during this frenzy of activity that I first met Dale. The sound of our hammering and laughter must have caught his attention because, before long, he wandered over from up the road. He was a grizzled man, the kind of person you could immediately peg as a local. His thick Hudson Valley accent rolled off his tongue, and his mannerisms were rough, almost impatient. "Hey there," he greeted, waving one calloused hand. We exchanged introductions. Dale seemed friendly enough at first, asking about the work we were doing and joking about how we picked the coldest time of year to settle in. But there was something unsettling about the way he lingered. Even after we'd finished our conversation, he hung around watching as we carried furniture inside. My dad, always the sociable type, tried to chat with him a bit more, but Dale and answers were clipped, almost curt. Finally, he shuffled back up the road without saying goodbye. The weekend ended, and we all returned to the city. 2 weeks later, I made the trip back up alone. I had more things to bring: my snowboarding gear, a Wi-Fi router, and some other essentials. It was a quiet day, and I felt more at home with every step I took into the property, that is, until Dale showed up again. I hadn't even unpacked when I heard a knock on the door. I turned to find him already stepping inside, a wide grin on his face. "Looking good in here," he said, his eyes scanning the room as though it belonged to him. "Thanks," I replied, trying to mask my unease. After some small talk, he invited me over for a beer. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe getting to know the neighbor was a good idea. Besides, it felt rude to refuse his home, just up the road. Was another mobile home, slightly larger than mine but far more weathered. We sat on his deck where he handed me a Heineken and sat across the table. The conversation started innocently enough. I asked how long Higu lived in the area, and his response, 20 years too long, came with a bitter laugh. From there, his mood darkened. When he asked why, Higu moved here. I explained that I wanted a peaceful escape from Queens and a place close to the snowboarding mountain. His face twisted at the mention of the city. "City folk," he muttered under his breath. "You come out here and ruin everything. Pollute the place, litter all over, think you own the damn world." I was taken aback, but I tried to defend myself, explaining that I loved the area and wanted to preserve it, not harm it. But Dale wasn't interested in reason. His voice grew louder, his gestures more erratic, as he ranted about outsiders taking over. "I don't know why y'all can't just stay where the hell you belong," he shouted, slamming his beer down on the table. That was my cue to leave standing up. I forced a polite smile. "Thanks for the beer," I said. "I think I head back now." Dale didn't respond, just stared at his beer as I walked away. When I was about 100 feet down the road, I heard him call out, "I'm sorry." I turned, gave him a thumbs up, and kept walking. But the encounter left me rattled. Dale wasn't just a quirky local. He was angry, volatile, and maybe a little unhinged that night. As I lay on the mattress watching a movie on my laptop, I heard something outside, a voice, low and muttering. My chest tightened as I strained to hear. It sounded like someone talking to themselves, their words laced with curses. I crept to the window and peered out, but the yard was pitch black. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, hiding whoever or whatever was out there. The next morning, Dale showed up again, knocking insistently on my door. "Hey, I know you're in there," he called out. "Your car here." I stayed silent, too unnerved to answer. He knocked for what felt like 5 minutes straight, the sound echoing through the empty house. Finally he stopped, but I didn't dare look outside. Was he still there, waiting for me to come out? That night, the voice returned. It was louder this time, cutting through the faint hum of the movie I was watching. I turned off the television, my heart pounding as I stepped onto the deck and flicked on the light. There he was. Dale stood just 5 feet into the woods, his arms hanging limp at his sides, his face obscured by the shadows of the trees. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. The light startled him, and he bolted, vanishing into the darkness with an unsettling speed. I rushed back inside, locking the door and calling my dad. "Don't call the cops yet," he said. "You don't not want to escalate things unless it's absolutely necessary." But the next hour proved it was necessary. Dale returned, his voice rising in a drunken rage. "I know you in there. Leave. No one wants you here." His screams filled the night, raw with fury and venom. I stayed up until dawn, every creak of the house making my heart race. The next day I packed my things, loaded the car with everything valuable, and left. I haven't been back since, but I know I have to return someday, and when I do, I won't go alone. If Dale tries anything again, the cops will be called. No hesitation. For now, though, I'm left with the creeping dread that my neighbor isn't just unwelcoming, dangerous, and I can't shake the feeling that the deal I got on this house came at a much greater cost than I realized. The year I turned 13, Halloween felt different. There was an electric charge in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up for no reason. That year my best friend Jason invited me and 2 other friends, Ethan and Sam, to spend Halloween night at his house. Jason in place was not your typical neighborhood home. It was a sprawling old property just outside of town, surrounded by woods. It seemed like the perfect setting for an unforgettable Halloween adventure. Jason had a plan. We'd trick or treat until our bags were full, then settle in for a night of scary movies. It sounded perfect. By the time the sky darkened, we were out in the neighborhood, going door to door. The houses in Jason area were spaced far apart, making every walk between them feel like a trek through the unknown. But that only added to the fun, so we thought. We were nearly done for the night, our bags brimming with candy, when we approached a house that stood apart from the others. It was darker, older, and had a sense of neglect that made us pause. The porch light flickered, as if struggling to stay alive against our better judgment. We walked up the creaking wooden steps and knocked. The door opened to reveal a tall, thin woman with shoulder-length, unkempt hair. Her presence was unsettling, her gaze distant and strange. The acrid smell of cigarettes wafted out, making us gag slightly. The house behind her was dim, the walls stained, and the faint sound of a television droned somewhere deeper inside. "Sorry, kids," she said with a raspy voice. "I'm all out of candy, but wait here. We'll see if I can find something for you." We exchanged uneasy glances as she disappeared inside. The moments stretched into an eternity. When she returned, she held a crumpled brown paper bag filled with candies that looked as old as the house itself. Some were unwrapped, others sticky and covered in lint. Jason, always polite, thanked her, but quickly added, "Aripon." "No thank you, Mamam. We about to leave anyway. Our ride-in waiting for us." Her demeanor changed instantly. Her hand shot out, grabbing Ethan's wrist. "No, please take it," she insisted, her voice trembling, then yanked his arm free, and we stumbled back. The woman retreated into her house, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Without a word, we hurried down the driveway and away from that house. We decided to hit a few more houses before calling it a night, that and when we heard the shouting. From the direction of the neighborhood parking lot, a woman's anguished cries pierced the air. "They took my child! They took her!" We froze. It was her woman from the house. She was pounding on a car, her fists hammering the hood as she screamed. My stomach dropped when I realized it was Jason's parents' car. She was throwing herself at it, clawing and shouting incoherently. The commotion drew out several neighbors. One of them grabbed the woman and pulled her back, speaking to her in a hushed, urgent tone. Another approached us and apologized profusely. Trouble. They explained, it in all just a misunderstanding. Jason's mom hurried us into the car. As we pulled away, the woman broke free from the neighbors and darted in front of the vehicle, forcing us to stop. She slapped the hood with both hands and screamed, "Ah, you took my child! Give her back!" It took the neighbors' combined effort to drag her away. Shaken and silent, we drove off into the night. Later, back at Jason's house, the air of unease lingered. We tried to distract ourselves with movies, but the tension in the room was palpable. Around midnight, as the last of the scary movies ended, we decided to call it a night. That's when we noticed the light in the hallway flick on. The faint glow seeped under the bedroom door. We waited, expecting Jason's parents to poke their heads in and tell us to go to sleep. But no one came. Curiosity got the better of us. I volunteered to check. Slowly I crept to the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. No one was there. Jason and the others joined me, their faces pale. We turned off the light and returned to the room, locking the door behind us. Jason whispered, "But do you think it or her?" We all looked toward the large window that faced the backyard, and then we saw her. She was standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight, staring directly into the house. The moment her gaze met ours, she bolted, disappearing into the shadows. We barricaded ourselves in the room, our hearts pounding. The night stretched on, every creak of the house making us jump. Sleep came only in fragments, and when the dawn finally broke, it brought little relief. The next morning, Jason's mom seemed rattled. She told us the events of the previous night had shaken her so badly that she could have sworn she saw someone standing over her bed in the middle of the night. We didn't have the courage to tell her what we had seen. The truth was too unsettling, too horrifying. As we left Jason's house later that day, one thought lingered in all our minds. What if that woman had stayed outside? What if, for a brief, terrifying moment, she had been inside the house with us? Halloween is supposed to be fun, night of costumes, candy and laughter echoing through the streets. But last year, Halloween fell on a Wednesday, and for me, it was anything but fun. It was terrifying that year. I was home alone. My dad, who worked night shifts, had left for his job. My mom was staying with her sister due to some ongoing marital disputes, and my older sister was away at college. This left me as the sole provider for trick-or-treaters. My dad, in his peculiar way, had made a point of emphasizing Halloween. He bought a couple of hefty bags of Kit Kats and left strict instructions. They better be empty by the end of the night. By the time I got home from classes, it was already dark. The neighborhood was alive with kids dressed as monsters, septurnors, and ghosts. Barely had I dropped my backpack on the couch when the doorbell rang, and it kept ringing. For the next few hours, I played the role of candy distributor, juggling the constant stream of trick-or-treaters while attempting to tackle some homework. By around 9 p.m., the buzz of Halloween had begun to wind down. The streets grew quieter, and the ringing of the doorbell had slowed to a trickle. I was starting to relax. Then the doorbell rang again. It had been nearly half an hour since the last visitor, so I grabbed the near-empty bowl of Kit Kats, expecting to find a few straggling kids. But when I opened the door, it wasn't kids. Standing there, under the dim glow of the porch light, was a man. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in plain, nondescript clothes. His expression was unnervingly neutral as he gave me a small wave. He did not say anything, did not try to engage me. Just waved. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. Something about him felt off. He didn't look like he belonged, especially not out here in the middle of suburban trick-or-treat territory. The silence dragged on. Then he reached for the handle of the storm door. That when I snapped into action without a second thought. I slammed the main door shut and locked it. My heart pounded as I stepped back, peering through the peephole. He had moved, just stood there staring at the door now. I quickly texted my family group chat, explaining what had just happened. My dad's response was his usual no-nonsense style. "If he comes back, go outside and teach him a lesson." Not exactly helpful advice, but I figured that was it for the night still shaking. I decided I was done answering the door. I retreated to my room to focus on my homework, hoping the man would simply disappear. But he did. A while later. I heard shouting from outside.
Annoyed and a little scared, I got up and cautiously slid my bedroom window open. Sure enough, there he was, standing on the sidewalk looking up at me. His voice was loud but strangely uneven as he yelled something about needing help finding his son. I did believe him, not for a second. I texted my family again. My dad had advice this time. "Oh, ignore him. He'll leave." I closed my window, shut off my bedroom light, and moved to the basement. It felt safer down there. No windows, no way for him to see me. I tried to focus on my work, convincing myself that he'd get bored and move on. Then the power went out. The basement plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of my phone. My stomach dropped. The timing was too perfect. He must have tampered with the electric box outside. I texted my family in a panic. They told me to call the police immediately. I did, whispering to the dispatcher about the man and my suspicion that he was trying to break in. She assured me officers were on their way. All I had to do was stay hidden. I tried to stay calm. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of floorboards creaking overhead. Someone was inside the house. My heart felt like it might burst from my chest as I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the slow, deliberate steps. Whoever it was, they were moving around, exploring. The sound stopped, then started again. Heading toward the basement door, I gripped my phone tightly, texting my family updates as quietly as I could. My mom kept urging me to stay put. "Don't they make a sound," she said. The basement door opened with a groan. I stopped breathing, lined from the hallway, spilled onto the stairs, and I saw him, just his legs at first. He stepped down slowly, pausing halfway down the staircase. He stood there, silent, for what felt like an eternity. Then he mumbled something. It was incoherent, like gibberish, and it sent chills down my spine. I didn't dare move. Suddenly, his voice cut through the silence. "I can see you." My blood ran cold. Was he bluffing, or could he really see me in the dark? His legs remained motionless, but now I felt his gaze. It was unbearable, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, a loud bang echoed through the house. The front door, the man froze. After a moment, he turned and walked back up the stairs, closing the basement door behind him. I waited, straining my ears to hear his movements. Footsteps creaked above, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. Minutes later, I heard voices, authoritative, commanding. The police. I bolted up the stairs and opened the front door to find the officers searching the area. They did find him. He was gone. In the aftermath, the police confirmed my suspicions. The back door had been unlocked. Higu let himself in. The electric box outside had been tampered with, just as I thought. Till this day, I don't know who that man was or why he chose my house that night. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe he had planned it. Knowing Halloween would make it easy for him to blend in. All I know is that something about him was not right. He didn't belong. Not in my neighborhood, not on my doorstep, and certainly not in my house. And I'd never forget the way he said, "I can see you." It was Halloween night, though the year escapes me now. Maybe 4 years ago, give or take. What I do recall clearly is that it was a Saturday, the perfect day for mischief, with no classes to worry about the next morning. My friend Tanner and I had one goal in mind, to do something truly spine-chilling that evening. After tossing around a few ideas, we settled on the most daring option, visiting the abandoned house perched on the hill. a place whispered about in campus circles. The house had earned an ominous nickname, the Blair Witch House. It wasn't just the name that added to its mystique. Its isolation, tucked away behind overgrown trees and shielded by years of neglect, gave it an aura of pure dread. The property had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Some claimed it was haunted, others insisted it was merely a creepy relic of the past. Either way, it seemed perfect for our Halloween adventure. By 10 o'clock, Tanner and I were driving up the dark, winding road that led to the house. His car bumped along the uneven dirt path until we reached the edge of the property. The headlights cast eerie shadows over the surrounding brush before Tanner killed the engine. We stepped out, backpacks slung over our shoulders, we-do packed with more confidence than sense, flashlights, a couple of knives, and even a crowbar Tanner had insisted on bringing. We didn't know what we'd face, but we wanted to be prepared. The house loomed at the top of the hill like a ghostly silhouette against the night sky. Its windows were jagged black holes, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting us in or warning us to stay away. My skin prickled with unease as we trudged up the incline, crunching through dead leaves that seemed far too loud in the stillness. Tanner pushed the front door open with a creak, and we stepped into absolute darkness. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of mold and decay. We switched on our flashlights, their beams slicing through the gloom to reveal an interior stripped bare of almost everything. The walls were peeling, the floors littered with broken glass and debris, and any furniture that might have once been here was long gone. The house was a skeleton of what it had been, and yet it felt alive in a way that made my stomach churn. For a while, it was just an empty, lifeless exploration. We wandered through the first floor, finding little of interest. Then, as we stood in what might have been a living room, a sound shattered the silence. Thump. It came from above us. Tanner and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks. Probably just an Anner, Tanner whispered, though his voice was unconvincing. Still, we both knew we couldn't leave without checking it out. Curiosity, or maybe foolishness, compelled us. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed. Each step felt like it might give way, but we pressed on, Tanner leading the way. At the top was a narrow hallway, its wooden floor warped and creaking. 3 doors lined the hall, their paint blistered and peeling. We peeked into the first room on the left. It was tiny, barely more than a closet, with an ancient bed frame collapsed in one corner. Nothing there. The second door on the left led to a bathroom, empty, save for a cracked sink and a missing mirror. That left the third door on the right. Tanner hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room beyond was larger, and it felt different. Colder somehow. This was the master bedroom. A rusted bed frame sat eerily in the center, and scraps of what might have once been carpet clung to the edges of the wooden floor. We stepped inside, scanning the room with our flashlights. My pulse quickened as I searched for the source of the sound. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind us. The sharp bang sent my heart into my throat. Before I could react, the room lit up with a sudden, blinding white flash, and then another. It was like camera flashes, rapid and startling, but there was no one there. At least no one we could see. Tanner let out a panic yell, wrenching the door open with trembling hands. I didn't wait to ask questions. I bolted after him, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we fled down the stairs, through the front door and out into the night. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Tanner fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine, and we sped off, leaving that cursed house behind us. Neither of us spoke the entire drive back to campus. The terror was too fresh, too real. For a week, we did talk about what had happened. We tried to push it out of our minds, to convince ourselves it was nothing more than a prank or a trick of the imagination. But then, Tanner sent me a text, a picture of a photograph he was holding. In the photo, Tanner and I stood side by side in that master bedroom, our flashlights illuminating our shocked faces. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stared at the image, found it under my windshield wipey Tannerman message. Read, I immediately called him, telling him to throw the photos away and park somewhere else. He agreed, but I could hear the unease in his voice. We only told a few close friends about what happened that night. None of them believed us, of course, and I don't blame them, but we never went near that house again. And to this day, I can't explain who, what, was in that room with us. When our old neighbors moved out, it felt like a fresh start. They weren't the easiest people to live next to, so my wife and I were relieved when we saw their house finally empty. Then, a few months ago, a new van appeared in the driveway next door. At first, we were optimistic. Maybe this was the beginning of a better chapter. We were so wrong. The van showed up one evening, parked neatly in the driveway. There were no moving trucks, no signs of furniture being hauled in, nothing. It was strange, but we chalked it up to them, keeping things minimal. Trying to be neighborly, my wife and I decided to introduce ourselves. We knocked on the door, but no one answered. The van was there, the house lights were off, and the whole scene felt hollow. Maybe they were in the shower, we told ourselves, or asleep. That didn't explain the unease that lingered after we walked back home. On our bedroom window, we had a view into their backyard and the detached garage that sat at the far end of their property. Days passed without a glimpse of the mysterious new neighbor. Then one night, when we were reading in bed, the silence was broken by the metallic screech of a garage door rolling open. My wife and I exchanged curious glances and moved to the window. Under the cold glow of a motion-activated floodlight, a man emerged. He was middle-aged, wearing a plain white t-shirt and jeans. His movements were slow, deliberate. He carried boxes from the van into the garage, one by one. There was something unsettling about him, though I couldn't pinpoint why. We stepped back from the blinds, feeling intrusive. Still, the image of him moving through the night lingered in my mind. A few nights later, the sound returned, this time louder and stranger. It wasn't just the garage door. Metallic scraping echoed across the still night air, accompanied by sporadic thumps and bangs. My wife woke up first, shaking me awake with urgency. "Do you hear that?" I listened. The sounds were erratic, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Against my better judgment, I went to the window to investigate. There he was again, in the dim light of his garage, but this time I wasn't discreet. As I stared, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. My stomach dropped. His expression was void of emotion, yet his gaze pinned me in place. I jerked back from the window, my heart pounding. Moments later, the scraping stopped, and the garage door slammed shut. The air in the room felt suffocating, but I have to go over there. I told my wife, trying to summon courage. She begged me not to, but I could just ignore the eerie exchange. I threw on a t-shirt, stepped outside, and approached his driveway. Before I could call out to him, the vanny engine roared to life. He backed out of the driveway so quickly it was reckless, his tires screeching as he sped off into the darkness. I stood there stunned. Who was this man? And what was he doing? Later that week, my wife shook me awake in the dead of night. "I heard the gate," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone in the backyard, groggy but on edge." I tried to brush her off. "Are you imagining thing?" I mumbled, but then I heard it too. The faint creak of a hinge, the soft crunch of footsteps on the grass. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way downstairs. From the window, I saw his van parked in the driveway again. but his house was completely dark. My pulse quickened as I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. The air was cold, heavy with silence. Then from the shadows I heard quick, scuffling footsteps followed by the slam of the gate. Someone had been here. No doubt about it. I ran toward the gate, throwing it open and scanning the street. There was no one, just the eerie stillness of the neighborhood at night. Yet I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the darkened corners of the street. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. But it in him. I told my wife. It has to be. The next morning, I spoke with Jin, the neighbor 2 doors down. He hadn't met the new guy either, but admitted had been woken up several nights by strange noises coming from the Manning garage, scraping, banging, and once what he swore sounded like muffled crying. That last detail sent a chill through me. Crying. My mind raced, conjuring images I did want to entertain. We decided to team up. If the noises happened again, we'd confront him together. The next day, as I opened the living room blinds, I froze. There, standing in one of his windows, was the man. He was stiff, his pale face partially obscured by the shadow of the curtains, but his eyes were unmistakable, locked onto me unblinking. I waited for him to look away, to move, to do anything, but he just stood there staring. I waved hesitantly, more out of discomfort than friendliness. He didn't wave back. He didn't even blink. "Come here," I called to my wife, my voice tight. By the time she reached the window, he was gone. I could take it anymore. My wife and I marched to his door, pounding on it with determination. A loud echoing bang came from somewhere inside the house, but he never answered. My stomach churned with unease. That night Jen texted me, muffled, crying again. "Check your backyard." I didn't want to. I didn't want to find whatever was causing those sounds, but I had to know when I reached the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your heartbeat sound deafening. 2 weeks have passed, and the van hasn't returned. The house next door sits dark and empty, but the tension hasn't lifted. Jean and I still wake up some nights, convinced we hear faint noises from the direction of the garage. My wife says I should call the police, report him anonymously, but I'm scared of what they might find. Worse, what they want, whatever secrets our neighbor held, they am buried in that garage. And I can shake the feeling that one day the van will return. When I was 7, my family and I lived in a tough neighborhood, the kind of place where trust didn't come easily, and vigilance was a necessity. Though many details of those years are hazy to me, there ran one story my mom has recounted so vividly that it feels like a memory etched into my own mind. It was a night like any other. Ordinary, quiet, unremarkable is what makes what happened so terrifying that evening. It was just my mom, my 2 younger siblings, and me at home. My dad was away on one of his frequent business trips, leaving my mom to hold down the fort. We were tucked away in our rooms, fast asleep, while my mom stayed up a little later, catching up on some reading. The clock ticked past midnight, and the stillness of the house was interrupted by a sudden knock at the front door. Startled, my mom paused, her heart beating a little faster. She approached the door cautiously, calling out, Who is it?" Silence, no response. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, but she reasoned it could be kids playing a prank. Ding-dong ditching wasn't uncommon even in our rough neighborhood. Shaking her head, she returned to bed, hoping it was a one-off disturbance. 30 minutes later, the knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent. Alarmed, my mom grabbed her robe and tiptoed to the living room. She peered through the side window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there, but the porch was empty. Shadows from the street lights danced eerily across the lawn,
but there was no sign of anyone. In a safer neighborhood, my mom might have dismissed it as a prank, but here, she knew better. Danger lurked in every corner. The unease settled deep in her chest, and she decided to arm herself. From the bedroom closet, she retrieved my dad's shotgun, a heavy weapon she hoped she would have to use. Cradling it in her hand, she settled into the darkened living room, waiting, her eyes trained on the front door. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the silence became almost unbearable. And then, another knock. My mom's pulse quickened. She stood and moved cautiously to the window, her fingers gripping the shotgun tightly. Again, there was no one there. This time her fear turned to anger. She shouted through the door, her voice steady and firm despite her racing heart. "Am calling the police. If you try to get in here, I shoot you." The threat hung in the air, a warning meant to scare off whoever was tormenting her. After that, the knocking stopped. The house fell into an uneasy silence. My mom decided to wake us up, just in case she didn't want to frighten us, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that something worse might happen. She gathered my siblings and me in her room, telling us to stay close to her until the police arrived at around 2 a.m. The police finally pulled up. 2 officers conducted a brief search around the property while we huddled inside, anxiously awaiting news. When they came to the door, one of them held a piece of barbed wire, about 4 feet long. "Well, does this belong to you?" he asked. My mom shook her head, her stomach sinking. "Number, why?" The officer. Subsection was grim. "So we think whoever was knocking planned to use this to harm you. It on good you did open the door if you had." He let the unfinished sentence linger, the implication chilling. The officers promised to patrol the neighborhood until morning, and assured my mom they gave return at first light for a more thorough investigation. None of us slept that night. My mom stayed by the window, shotgun in hand, while we clung to her, too scared to close our eyes. When morning came, the police conducted a detailed search of the property. What they found only deepened the horror. Footprints led from the front door around to the back of the house, stopping beneath my bedroom window. The window wound frame bore fresh scratches, evidence that someone had tried to pry it open but failed. The thought of a stranger attempting to break into my room sent shivers down my spine. Even as a child too young to fully comprehend the danger, my mom had her suspicions about who might be responsible. Our next-door neighbor was an odd, unsettling man. He kept to himself, rarely spoke, and often watched our house from behind his curtains. He knew my dad's schedule, recognized his car, and would have been aware that he was away that night. Though we could prove it, my mom always believed he was the one who tried to get inside our home that night. Not long after we packed up and left that neighborhood, my parents didn't want to take any more chances. To this day, my mom says that trusting her instincts and keeping the door locked saved her life and ours. We never found out who the midnight knocker was, but the memory of that night remains a stark reminder of the danger we narrowly escaped. It happened about a year ago, on a quiet evening when the world seemed at ease. It was close to 9 p.m., and the rural landscape around our home was cloaked in a heavy stillness that only deepened as the night wore on. Our house sat alone on a stretch of gravel road, with no neighbors for miles. The isolation had always been comforting, but that night it felt like a double-edged sword. The knock on the door was abrupt and sharp, cutting through the hum of the old ceiling fan. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sound. Visitors at that hour were unheard of, and in a place as remote as ours, any unexpected arrival set nerves on edge. "Mom," I called softly, my voice tight with unease. She appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression curious but calm. I explained what I'd heard, and she nodded, moving towards the front door. Despite her composed demeanor, I noticed the slight hesitation in her step, a sign she shared my apprehension. The porch light flickered on, casting a weak glow through the glass panes. Standing on the other side of the door was a man, his face partially shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with a wiry build and a nervous energy that seemed to emanate from him like static. "Stay back," Mom instructed, her voice firm but quiet. She cracked the door open just enough to speak to him. "Good evening, ma'am," the man greeted, his voice overly polite, almost rehearsed. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I wanted to tell you about a new business I'm starting. We promoting American-made products, and I wanted to offer you a free sample to try out." I stayed out of sight but close enough to hear every word. My heart thudded in my chest as he extended a white container through the doorframe, May Clorox bottle. My mom accepted it with visible reluctance, her eyes never leaving his face. "Just a moment," the man said, retreating toward a minivan parked at the end of our driveway. "I'd grab a vacuum cleaner sample to show you." It was then that Mom saw them. 5 shadowy figures sitting inside the vehicle, their faces obscured by the dim interior light. Her posture stiffened, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. Without turning her head, she called over her shoulder, her voice low and urgent, "Go, find the phone." We did have a landline, and my cell phone was nowhere to be found. I tore through the house, my panic rising with each passing second. Failing to locate it, I grabbed the first thing I could, nay, kitchen knife. My hands trembled as I positioned myself just around the corner, out of sight but ready to act if things escalated. Bank at the door. Momer's tone had shifted. It was no longer polite or patient. She held the Clorox bottle like it was toxic, stepping further into the doorway to face the man. "You need to leave now." The man paused, visibly taken aback by her sudden change in demeanor. "Mama, I don't care what you were just doing," she snapped, her voice rising. "Get off my property, or I'd call the cops." She hurled the container onto the porch, where it landed with a loud clatter. The sound seemed to break whatever spell of tension had held the man in place. He glanced back at the van, then turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath. The minivan roared to life as he climbed into the driver's seat. Its tires spat gravel as they reversed hastily, the headlights cutting jagged beams through the darkness. I crept toward the window, peering out from behind the curtain as they sped down the road, disappearing into the night. For several minutes after they were gone, the house remained silent except for the sound of our breathing. Mom locked the door and bolted it firmly before turning to me. Her face was pale but resolute, her hands trembling just slightly as she reached out to steady herself against the wall. We did sleep much that night, replaying the encounter in our minds, wondering what might have happened if things had gone differently. Who were they? What did they want? The questions haunted us long after the taillights had vanished, though we never saw that minivan. Those men, again, the memory of their visit left an indelible mark. In the quiet hours of the night, I sometimes find myself listening for sounds that don't belong, wondering if the darkness outside is as empty as it seems. When I was 17, I worked as a house cleaner to save up for college. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough for someone my age. The person I worked for the longest was a man named Jeffrey. He was quiet, reserved, and kept to himself. I only spoke to him once when I first met him, and a handful of times afterward when he came home early from work. He wasn't that particularly friendly or unfriendly, just neutral. I could tell if he was normal or hiding something beneath the surface. Jeffrey had one strict rule: do not go into the basement. He even posted a bold handwritten sign on the basement door as a reminder. The rule didn't seem suspicious at first. Lots of people have private areas in their homes they don't want touched. But as weeks passed, the sign became an itch in my brain I could scratch. I told myself over and over to let it go, but the curiosity gnawed at me. One afternoon, as I cleaned his bedroom, I gave in to a different temptation. While dusting his dresser, my hands lingered on the drawers. I don't know what compelled me. Call it boredom, youthful rebellion, or plain stupidity. Well, I decided to snoop. His larger drawers were stuffed with clothing, neatly folded and unremarkable. I moved to the smaller ones and found an assortment of random objects: cameras, batteries, photo albums, and trinkets. At first, it seemed innocent enough. But then, in the bottom drawer tucked into the corner like it was hiding, I found a small wooden box. It was locked. I stared at it, feeling my pulse quicken. That box seemed to hold secrets and I couldn't resist. I remembered seeing a small key on Jeffrey Keering in the kitchen. Could it be the one? I tiptoed down the stairs, my heart pounding as I took the keyring. Sure enough, one key looked like a perfect match for the box. Back in his bedroom, my hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The lid creaked open, revealing a stack of photographs. At first, they were innocuous, black and white shots of the house. But as I sifted through them, the images became disturbing. I was in every single photo. There I was in the living room, the hallway, the bedroom, every room of the house, including the bathroom. The thought that Jeffrey had been secretly photographing me made my stomach churn. Then, near the bottom of the stack, I found a color photograph that stood out. It was taken from outside, through the kitchen window. It showed me standing inside, completely unaware. Panic set in. I stuffed the photos back into the box, except for a few that I decided to keep as evidence. Locking the box, I returned it to the drawer exactly as Ibu found it. My hands were shaking and my breathing was shallow. I knew I had to leave, and I had no intention of coming back. As I headed for the front door, my eyes landed on the basement door. That sign stared back at me, daring me. Now that I was returning, the curiosity was unbearable. I had to know. I approached the door, and with a deep breath turned the knob. The smell hit me first, thick, pungent, and nauseating like rotting meat. I gagged, but I pressed on, flicking on the light. The basement was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The walls were covered in posters. Most were suggestive and unsettling, but some featured faces of boys and girls who couldn't have been much older than I was, so that my stomach twisted. But I kept looking. At the far end of the room, two doors stood side by side. The stench was strongest there, and I could hear a faint buzzing sound, like static or machinery. I didn't dare open those doors. Something deep in my gut screamed at me to leave. As I backed away, my eyes caught movement. In the corner of the room, a camera was mounted on the ceiling, its lens trained directly on me. For a moment, it moved, as if adjusting its angle. Then it stopped. That was it. I bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door behind me, and fled the house. My hands shook as I fumbled with my car keys, but I managed to start the engine and speed away. I did not look back. Jeffrey called me once after that. I didn't pick up, and he did leave a message to this day. I'm grateful I never gave him my address. Whatever secrets he was hiding in that house, I wanted no part of them. And I might never forget the feeling of those camera lenses watching me, or the suffocating air of that basement, or the color photograph of me standing in the kitchen, completely unaware of the eyes that had been on me all along. I've always been an adrenaline junkie. Ever since I was a kid, I found my passion in pushing boundaries, mountain climbing, parasailing, scuba diving, you name it. But among all my daring hobbies, skiing had always held a special place in my heart. Every winter, I do head upstate at least 10 times to hit the slopes, sometimes with friends, other times alone. There was something uniquely freeing about carving through untouched snow, the icy wind biting at my cheeks as I raced downhill. When my friend Hugh, let us call him Q, agreed to join me for a camping and backcountry skiing trip, I was thrilled. Backcountry skiing is all about tackling unmarked and unpatrolled areas outside ski resort boundaries, and I do been itching for a new challenge. The drive upstate took about 3 hours, with the final stretch requiring some off-roading to reach the secluded hills. The truck groaned under the weight of our gear as we bumped along the rugged terrain, finally coming to a stop at the base of a promising slope. The area was dense with trees, and it became clear the truck could go any further. We unloaded our skis, camping gear, and provisions, then began the arduous trek to find a suitable campsite. About a quarter-mile in, we found a clearing nestled at the foot of an uphill slope, perfect for our needs. The work of setting up camp began, pitching the tent, unrolling sleeping bags, and organizing our supplies. Once everything was in order, the real fun began. We strapped on our skis and started exploring the hills, the untouched snow crunching beneath us with every step. As the day progressed, the slopes challenged us in the best way possible. At one point, Q and I got separated on a larger hill. I assumed he'd make his way to the bottom, and we'd regroup there as usual. I tried reaching him on the walkie-talkie, but only static crackled back. Figuring he was still skiing down, I decided to wait for him at the base. It was then that I encountered someone, another skier. He approached with an easygoing demeanor, his ski mask obscuring most of his face. "Any good hills around here?" he asked, his voice friendly yet muffled. He had an orange backpack strapped over his skis and mentioned he and his wife were looking for a good spot to camp near others. I hesitated, caught off guard by the request, but eventually relented. "Sure, I show you where our campsite is," I offered, pulling out my walkie to let Q know I'd be away for a bit. Static greeted me again, but I figured he'd reconnect with him soon enough. The trek back to the campsite was filled with light conversation, though I found myself unnerved by how little the man revealed about himself. Something about his gear nagged at the edge of my mind, though I couldn't quite place it. My unease deepened as I noticed something chillingly familiar about his skis and backpack. They were Cume. For a split second, I wondered if this was some elaborate prank, but the voice, his entire presence, was all wrong. Panic surged as the man closed the gap between us. I darted into the tent, desperately rummaging for my flare gun. His grip clamped around my leg, dragging me back as I felt a sudden, searing pain. A sharp, electrifying jolt followed by a burning heat. I screamed, thrashing wildly, and managed to grab the flare gun. With trembling hands, I shoved aside the tent flap and aimed it at him. The man froze, his hand shooting into the air. That's when I saw it, knife buried deep in my leg, blood soaking through my snow pants. "Where is my friend?" I demanded, my voice trembling with equal parts fear and fury. "Bottom of the hill," he stammered, his bravado crumbling. I found him there, keeping the flare gun trained on him. I reached for my phone to call for help. As I fumbled with the device, the man bolted, disappearing into the trees before I could stop him. Alone, injured and bleeding, I felt time crawl as I waited in the freezing cold for rescue. The wind howled around me, each gust a cruel reminder of my vulnerability. When the sound of rotor blades finally shattered the oppressive silence, relief flooded through me. I fired the flare into the sky, its fiery arc guiding the rescue team to my location. They loaded me into the helicopter, my leg throbbing in agony as I directed them toward the hill where Q had been left behind. We found him lying motionless in the snow, unconscious and pale. Like me, he'd been attacked, stabbed in the leg, and left to freeze. His walkie-talkie had been his lifeline, but the connection had failed him when he needed it most. Both of us were rushed to the hospital, where we received treatment for our injuries. Though the physical wounds healed, the memory of that day remains etched in my mind. I still love the thrill of extreme sports, But the mountains no longer feel as safe, and I never venture into the back country without a second thought again. We were a young couple, brimming with optimism, having just moved into our first home together. It was a modest yet charming house, with 3 floors stacked like chapters in a storybook. The den, a cozy retreat, nestled on the lowest floor. Our bedroom was conveniently on the first floor, a space we thought would offer peaceful nights and restful sleep. Upstairs, an array of unused rooms awaited a purpose, their emptiness resonating with potential. Yet, from the moment we settled in, the house seemed to have other plans. The first few nights were uneventful. We laughed as we unpacked, envisioning our future here. Then, something changed. It began subtly. The noise, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It came from below. Initially, we dismissed it. Houses make noises after all. But as the nights wore on, the sounds grew louder and harder to ignore. A faint scraping, followed by an occasional low groan, always seeming to emanate from beneath our bed. One night, curiosity and unease got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I crouched by the edge of the bed and peered underneath. Dust motes danced in the beam, but there was nothing else. No source for the unsettling sounds. I tapped the wooden floor, wondering if an old pipe might explain the noises, but the sound seemed deeper, as if it came from somewhere below the house. Yet, there was no basement. That was the first puzzle. The second came in the mornings. Each day brought small but undeniable changes. A door left ajar that we were certain had been closed the night before. A window unlocked, despite our diligence. It was my wife-feed closet door that unsettled us the most. No matter how firmly we closed it, it would always stand open by morning, yawning as though inviting us to peer into its depths. We tried everything to explain it. Perhaps it was a draft, we reasoned, though we sealed every window. Maybe the house was settling, though the sounds and movements defied logic. Determined to solve the mystery, we stayed up late one night, vowing to discover the truth. That night, the noises were louder than ever. The scraping turned into something heavier, like objects being dragged. Faint moans joined the cacophony, chilling and mournful. My wife clutched my hand, her knuckles white. "It incoming from the den," I whispered. Together we crept downstairs, the wooden steps creaking under our weight. The air grew colder as we descended, heavy with an intangible dread. In the den, the noises seemed concentrated. Pressing my ear to the wall, I strained to locate their source. My pulse quickened. Was coming from the wall itself, but lower, as though it resonated from beneath the very foundation of the house. I returned to my wife, and we agreed to stay awake as long as we could. If we could catch whoever was responsible, we might finally get answers. Hours ticked by, each one more exhausting than the last. By 2 my wife was nodding off, and I was not far behind. Despite our best efforts, sleep claimed us. A cold, trembling hand woke me. My wife was shaking me, her face pale and tear-streaked. She pointed silently to her closet, her finger quivering. My heart froze. The closet door was wide open, but that wasn't all. Within the shadowed recesses of the closet, a hidden door stood ajar, revealing a ladder that plunged into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and motioned for my wife to lock the bedroom door and call the police, armed with a machete. More for courage than practicality, I descended the ladder. The rungs creaked under my weight, the air growing damp and stale as I went lower. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The sight chilled me. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow. Against one wall
stood a rickety cot, its thin mattress sagging with age. A table and chair occupied the center of the room, cluttered with odds and ends, old newspapers, empty cans, and what looked like children toys scattered across the floor. My flashlight caught the faded smile of a stuffed bear, its button eyes staring lifelessly. Then, from above, a scream shattered the silence. My wife. I scrambled up the ladder, the machete clutched tightly in one hand. As I neared the top, I heard a loud crash. Someone was breaking down the locked bedroom door. Reaching the top, I saw the door buckling, a hole punched through its center. A wild-eyed man was peering inside, his face gaunt and dirty, his eyes gleaming with a crazed intensity. He froze when he saw me, his gaze flicking to the machete in my hand. Without a word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. The police arrived shortly after, but the man was gone. They searched the house thoroughly, finding the hidden room, but no sign of how the intruder had entered, or how long he'd been there. The officers speculated it might have been an old bomb shelter, forgotten by time, but they could explain the man in presence or his connection to the room. We left the house the next day, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. To this day, I can't explain what happened, or who that man was. But every so often I think about the toys, the cot, and the faint noises that started it all, and I wonder what kind of life was being lived in the shadows beneath our feet. It had been a long, draining night, working the midnight shift at Stop and Shop. The fluorescent lights, the monotony of stocking shelves, and the occasional groggy customer stumbling in for late-night snacks had left me yearning for my bed. Finally, the clock struck the hour when I could clock out. My coworker James and I were the only ones left on duty. Together, we exited the store, the chill of the early morning air biting through our jackets as we made our way across the dimly lit parking lot. The lot was eerily quiet, bathed in the orange glow of flickering streetlights. James and I exchanged idle conversation, our breath visible in the cold. Just as we reached our cars, a black pickup truck rolled in, its engine rumbling low like a predator in growl. The vehicle pulled up beside us, blocking our path. Inside were two figures, a man and a woman. At first glance, they looked unkempt, like they had crawled out from the fringes of society. The man had a scruffy beard and a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. A cigarette dangled lazily from the corner of his mouth, the tip glowing faintly in the dark. The woman beside him had matted, greasy hair that framed her face, which appeared just as grimy. The man leaned out the window, his sharp eyes locking onto us. "You got any spare change for gas?" he asked, his voice rough like sandpaper. James and I exchanged a glance. There was an edge to the man in tone, something that set off alarm bells in my mind. James hesitated, but reached into his pocket, fishing out a couple of quarters and dropping them into the man in outstretched hand. Feeling the tension thickening in the air, I quickly handed him a crumpled dollar bill, hoping it would appease him. The man studied the money in his hand, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze snapped back to us, and a sneer crept across his face. "I'm gonna need more than that," he said, his voice low and menacing. James and I stammered out apologies, explaining that was all we had. The man let out a sharp curse, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. The woman beside him chuckled softly, her laughter sending chills down my spine. Her smile was anything but friendly. Knee was twisted, almost predatory. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in real danger. Without another word, I sidestepped around the truck, my heart hammering in my chest. I moved quickly, breaking into a near jog toward my car. James followed close behind, his footsteps echoing mine. Behind us, the pickup truck roared to life, its tires squealing as the man spun it around. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to unlock my car. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and threw the car into drive without a second hesitation.
James had already done the same, his taillights fading into the distance as he sped off. The trucker headlights swung around, flooding my rear-view mirror with blinding light. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I pressed the gas pedal, my car surging forward. The truck followed, its engine growling like a beast on the hunt. The streets were dark and deserted, and every twist and turn felt like a gamble. My pulse pounded in my ears as I weaved through back roads, trying to shake my pursuers. After what felt like an eternity, the trucker headlights finally disappeared. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I pulled into a gas station. Needing reassurance, I pulled out my phone and texted James. "You okay?" My fingers hovered over the screen as I waited, my heart still racing. Moments later, his reply came through. "Yeah, I'm fine. Are you relief washed over me?" But it was short-lived. As I sat in my car, trying to calm down, a pair of headlights appeared at the edge of the gas station lot. My stomach dropped. It was the same black pickup truck. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I turned the key in the ignition, my car roaring to life just as the truck pulled up in front of me, blocking my way out. The man in the driver's seat glared at me, but it was the woman who made my blood run cold. She leaned out the passenger window, a glint of metal in her hand. My heart nearly stopped as I realized she was holding a gun. Because she could lower the window completely, I slammed my car into reverse, tires screeching as I sped backward out of the parking lot. A deafening crack shattered the night to gunshot. The back window of my car exploded in a spray of glass. Zunian coursed through me as I hit the brakes, shifted into drive, and floored the gas pedal. Another shot rang out, the sound echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was on escaping. Streetlights blurred past as I swerved through empty roads, my breath coming in ragged gasps. After a harrowing chase, I finally managed to lose them. My heart was still pounding when I pulled into my driveway, the safety of home never feeling more fragile. As I stepped out of the car, I inspected the damage. The shattered rear window was bad enough, but my blood ran cold when I noticed 2 more bullet marks along the side of the vehicle. I barely slept that night, haunted by how close I do come to losing everything over something so senseless. The realization hit me hard. The world is full of people capable of terrifying things, and that night I do come face to face with them. I've only used crackless at least once in my life, and that one experience left me with a sour taste that I'll never forget. It wasn't the platform itself that was the problem. Me was the encounter it led me to. Hearing what happened, I stumbled upon an ad for a ping pong table, something I thought would be perfect for my roommate and me. The seller and post was straightforward, a sturdy table, lightly used, priced to sell. It seemed like a no-brainer, so I reached out and arranged to pick it up that evening. I even cleared out the back seats of my truck to make room. Little did I know I was preparing for something far darker than a simple purchase. That evening I pulled up in front of the Sellerin house, an unassuming 2-story home with overgrown bushes and a dim porch light barely illuminating the door. I texted him, "I'm here." Moments later the door creaked open. Eager to unwild the deal, I hopped out of my truck and walked briskly to the door. The man appeared in the doorway, a lanky figure shrouded in shadow. He had the distinct air of someone who smoked too much, his voice gravelly and low as he mumbled, "Come on in." I extended a hand for a handshake, but he didn't seem to notice. After an awkward pause, I dropped my arm and followed him inside. The house had a peculiar smell. Not unpleasant, but distinctly odd. It was a mix of stale air, something cottony, and a faint trace of smoke. It wasn't alarming, just off. He led me through a narrow hallway into the basement. The descent felt endless. each creaking step echoing in the confined space. At the bottom, I was greeted by the sight of the ping-pong table standing right in the center of the dimly lit room. It looked just like the pictures. Nothing seemed amiss. "Ah, shook," the man muttered, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Forgot the paddles. Wait here, I be right back." Before I could respond, he bolted up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The door closed behind him with a thud, leaving me alone in the basement. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed he was rummaging through some cluttered closet upstairs, looking for the paddles, but as the minutes ticked by, my patience thinned. The basement, with its low ceilings and dim lighting, began to feel suffocating. I wandered around, trying to pass the time. The room was sparsely furnished, but what caught my attention were the framed pictures scattered on the shelves and tables. They were all of him, just him. No family, no friends, no significant others. In one, he stood next to a scruffy dog, but that was the only photo with any sign of companionship. The strangeness of it all began to gnaw at me. After what felt like 10 minutes, I started to feel uneasy. Why was it taking him so long? My curiosity, or perhaps my growing suspicion, lured me to explore further. In the corner of the basement was a small laundry and storage room. The dim light barely illuminated the space, but I noticed a desk with a partially open drawer. Something compelled me to look. I slid the drawer open the rest of the way, revealing a stack of old Polaroid photos. At first glance, they seemed harmless, but as I sifted through them, my stomach churned. The images were horrifying. Pictures of a girl bound to a chair, her mouth covered with tape. Her eyes were wide with terror. My hands trembled as I sifted through more of the drawer contents. Next to the photos were rows of yellow folders, each labeled with a letter from A to Z. I didn't dare open them, my imagination already conjuring horrors I could unsee. I knew I needed evidence, so I pulled out my phone to snap pictures. But as I opened the camera app, I realized I had no service panic set in. The need to leave became overwhelming. I bolted to the basement stairs and tried the door, but it would budge. My heart sank. The door was locked. Then I heard his voice on the other side, deep, raspy, and uncomfortably calm. "Sorry about that," he said. "Annabelle must be locked by accident. Hang tight. I go grab the key." I didn't respond. I backed away from the door, scanning the room for anything that could help me escape. My eyes landed on the utility desk. I raced back down the stairs, rifling through the drawers until I found a set of screwdrivers. My hands fumbled as I tried each one in the lock. Finally, the smallest screwdriver fit. With a desperate twist, I felt the lock give way. The door creaked open, and I didn't waste a second. I sprinted out of the house, my breath ragged and my pulse pounding. I didn't look back, not at him, not at the house. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and sped off. I drove straight to the nearest police station. Shaking, I showed the officers the pictures I'd taken of the drawery contents and gave them the man and address. They promised to investigate. A few days later, I got a call from the police. The man had been arrested. He was part of an illicit network operating on the dark web, trafficking disturbing material. What he planned to do with me, I've never know, but I do know this, was lucky to get out of there alive. It went an experience I've never forget. I've never used Crackless Least again, and I never will. It was a late, moonless night when Andrew and I decided to set out on our daring adventure. We were both 18, restless and eager for something extraordinary to break the monotony of our small town. Andrew was my half-sister cousin, and a connection distant enough to feel like a partner in crime, but close enough to trust completely. The target of our curiosity was the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. a place shrouded in local legends and whispered warnings. It was well past midnight, and the roads were eerily silent as Andrew drove us there. Our plan wasn't just about curiosity. It was also about making a splash online. YouTube was still in its infancy, just a few years old, and videos of urban explorers venturing into decaying, forgotten places were gaining traction. Armed with flashlights and video cameras, each of which had night vision, new were determined to capture something thrilling. The asylum loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the dark sky. The chain-link fence that once encircled it had been cut open by someone before us, leaving a jagged hole just wide enough to crawl through. We slipped under, hearts pounding, and approached one of the broken windows. The shattered glass crunched beneath our shoes as we stepped carefully over planks that had once been nailed across the window to keep intruders out. The irony wasn't lost on me as we climbed inside. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a place abandoned for decades. Dust coated every surface, graffiti sprawled across the walls, and broken glass glittered like malicious stars under our flashlight beams. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Here and there, holes gaped in the wooden floor, their depths swallowed by darkness. We instinctively avoided looking down, as if acknowledging the void might invite it to swallow us whole. We wandered cautiously, the beams of our flashlights darting over peeling paint and cracked tiles. Every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet echoed through the empty halls, magnifying the tension in the air. Occasionally, we exchanged nervous laughs, but they felt hollow, in a weak attempt to mask the unease that clung to us like cobwebs. The first room that truly unsettled us was small and claustrophobic, dominated by a rusted dental chair surrounded by ancient, corroded equipment. Something about the sight made my skin crawl, as though the room still held echoes of the people who had once sat in that chair. But it was nothing compared to the bathroom upstairs. The bathroom was oppressive in its silence, save for the steady drip of water echoing from one of the stalls. When we approached, we found the stall door locked. The space beneath the door was far too small to crawl through, and the thought of forcing it open filled me with an inexplicable dread. The sound of that drip seemed louder and more deliberate with every passing second. Unable to bear it, we hurried out, leaving the room and its secrets behind. As we continued our exploration, we came across a door that led to a staircase. It descended into darkness, its yawning mouth an invitation to every teenage instinct to chase thrills. Armed with cameras, and bolstered by our shared bravado, we ventured down. The atmosphere changed as we descended. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The underground hallways were narrower, the darkness more absolute, broken only by our flashlight's feeble glow. We found a bulletin board affixed to one wall, its surface cluttered with old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. Leaning in closer, we strained to make out the faded images. That and when we heard it, a metallic clang echoed down the hall, sharp and deliberate. Our heads snapped toward the sound, and Andrew instinctively swung his flashlight in that direction. For a moment, there was nothing, and then we saw it, a glint of movement, unmistakable. The pale curve of a forehead slipping out of sight into one of the rooms farther down the hall. My stomach dropped and my throat tightened. Andrew's flashlight wavered as his hand shook. He didn't say a word. He just turned and bolted. My instincts kicked in, and I followed. The sound of our frantic footsteps ricocheting off the walls. As we raced back up the stairs, I heard it. A second set of footsteps. They were heavier, deliberate, and growing louder. Whoever or whatever it was chasing us. My chest tightened with terror as I realized I was at the back, the last in line. The sensation of something just behind me, reaching for me, was suffocating. My mind conjured vivid images of being grabbed and dragged back into the darkness, never to be seen again. But we did stop. The stairwell seemed endless, every step an eternity, we burst into the main hall and sprinted toward the window we had entered through. My hands fumbled as I climbed out, my heart hammering in my chest. Andrew was already outside, pulling me through as fast as he could. Juan inside the building. We heard an unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. It came from the stairwell we had just fled. We didn't wait to see what emerged. Scrambling to our feet, we bolted for Andrew's car, parked a short distance away. The silence of the night was shattered by the sound of our shoes pounding against the pavement. We threw ourselves into the car, locking the doors in one swift motion. Andrew turned the key and the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed from the tires as we sped away, leaving the asylum and its dark secrets behind us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. My hands trembled as I clutched my camera. The footage within a testament to our narrow escape. We never went back to that asylum. Whatever we had seen, or thought we seen, was enough to keep us away for good. To this day, I can still hear the echo of those footsteps behind us, and I wonder if something, or someone, still roams those dark hallways, waiting for the next intruder to cross its path. Last month, I arrived home late one night after spending the evening with my sister, brother-in-law, and a few of their friends. It was one of those quiet nights where the air feels heavy and the streets seem unusually empty. As I walked up to our front stoop, I noticed a note taped to the door. My mom and familiar handwriting stared back at me. "Take the garbage cans out to the front," I sighed, knowing I had no excuse not to do it. It was late, and the house was silent. Everyone was probably fast asleep. I made a mental note to be as quiet as possible while taking care of the task. The last thing I wanted was to wake anyone up. After slipping inside and grabbing my keys, I tiptoed back out and headed toward the side of the house where the garbage cans were lined up. As I rounded the corner, I suddenly froze in place. Voices, low and muffled. They drifted to the crisp night air. My heart started to race as I realized they were coming from our backyard. Swallowing hard, I crept closer and crouched by the fence, peeking through a tiny gap between the wooden slats. There, under the dim glow of our patio light, stood two figures. They were huddled near our patio table, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out their faces or what they were saying, but their presence sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just some harmless mistake. They did belong there. I ducked down, trembling, and backed away slowly. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I slipped inside and locked the door behind me. I knew I had to act quickly. My dad does not live with us, so there was no one else to turn to except my mom. I rushed to her bedroom, shaking her awake. "Mom, there are people in the back," I whispered urgently. Her eyes widened as the reality of what I said sunk in. We barely had time to process what was happening when a sound made us freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. They were coming. The creak of the stairs echoed through the house as I grabbed my mom in hand and pulled her toward the window. "We have to get out," I hissed. She hesitated, her face pale with fear. But I did not give her a choice. I practically shoved her toward the small ledge just outside the window. "Climb out," I urged, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated again, glancing at the door, but the footsteps were too close now. The doorknob jiggled, then turned. "Go!" I pleaded, and finally she swung a leg over the ledge. Just as she managed to climb out, the door burst open. Two shadowy figures stood in the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the dim light spilling in from the hallway. I didn't wait to see their faces. I scrambled out after my mom, adrenaline fueling every movement. The ledge was narrow and slippery, but somehow we managed to climb down to the grass below. Without a second thought, we ran.
barefoot and terrified, straight to our neighbor house. For the next 2 weeks, the incident haunted us. Every creak, every shadow seemed menacing. We tried to convince ourselves it was over, that whoever those people were, they were long gone. But deep down, I could shake the feeling that it was the end. Then came the night the phone rang. It was 3 a.m. when the shrill sound shattered the silence. I jolted awake, my heart racing. The ringing was relentless, each chime sending a jolt of unease through the house. I could hear my mom stirring in her room. After what felt like forever, she emerged, bleary-eyed but tense. We exchanged a glance, both of us, silently agreeing not to answer. But the phone did stop. It rang and rang, refusing to go to voicemail. Each unanswered call only added to the growing knot of dread in my stomach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mom yanked the phone cord out of the modem. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of us said a word. We just went back to bed, but neither of us slept a wink that night. The next day, as we tried to shake off the unease, my mom's phone buzzed. She frowned, picking it up. I could see the color drain from her face as she read the text message. "Why didn't you pick up?" Her hands trembled as she showed it to me. It was short, simple, and terrifying. Someone knew we had ignored the call. Someone was still watching. It'd been a week since that text. Every noise feels amplified. Every shadow feels like it, hiding something. Or someone we're trying to move forward. But the fear lingers, gnawing at the edges of our sanity. The worst part is not knowing when it might happen again. The waiting is unbearable. We lock every door and window, triple check them at night, but deep down, we know that if they want to come back, they will. And next time, we might not be so lucky. It was a quiet school night in a small suburban home, and Emma, a bright but occasionally forgetful 14-year-old girl, was fast asleep in her cozy bedroom. Her room was a mixture of childhood innocence and burgeoning teenage personality. Teo's collection of stuffed animals lined one corner, while posters of her favorite bands adorned the walls. The soft glow of moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting faint patterns across her desk, which sat cluttered with books and school papers. A sudden jolt of realization pulled Emma from her dreams. Her eyes fluttered open, and her heart sank as she remembered. There was homework due the next day, homework she hadn't even started. The thought sent a wave of anxiety through her. Her mind raced, her body sluggish as she turned to check the time. The digital clock on her bedside table glowed eerily red, the numbers forming an unforgiving 1:15 a.m. with a groan. She sat up and flicked on the lamp. The warm light filled the room, chasing away the shadows. Her fingers fumbled for a pencil, and she dragged a notebook toward her. The soft scratch of pencil lead against paper broke the stillness of the night as she tried to focus. Determined to complete her work before the sun rose, minutes passed. Then faintly she heard something. At first she thought it was her imagination. Meet soft rustling sound, almost imperceptible over the quiet hum of the house. She paused, her pencil hovering above the page, and tilted her head to listen. The sound came again, faint but distinct, like a subtle scrape or shuffle. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for an explanation. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. She sat frozen, her pulse quickening. The sound grew clearer now, as though someone, was moving within the walls of her bedroom. The soft scratching morphed into a deliberate pushing sound, as though something was forcing its way through her gaze, locked onto the square door of the storage space built into the wall beside her bed. The door, a little over 2 feet wide, was barely noticeable during the day, but in the dim glow of her room, it now seemed foreboding. The noises escalated. Emma's breath hitched, and she gripped the pencil tightly, her knuckles turning white. The storage door trembled slightly,
as though whatever was inside was trying to break free. Panic surged through her veins, and she bolted upright, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mom! Dad!" she screamed, her voice breaking with terror. The noises from the wall exploded into chaos, a frenzied series of thuds and scrapes, as though something was scrambling with unnatural speed. Her scream seemed to provoke whatever was inside. The square door suddenly burst open, the hinges screeching in protest. A figure emerged, crawling awkwardly through the opening. Emma's mind reeled as her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body was paralyzed with fear. The figure was a man, tall, heavy-set, and disheveled. His clothes were filthy, and his pale face was illuminated in the harsh glow of her lamp. His eyes were wild, darting around the room before settling on her. Before Emma could scream again, he lunged forward, clamping a large, grimy hand over her mouth. The force of his grip muffled her cries, and she struggled against him, her small frame no match for his weight. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she thrashed, kicking her legs in desperation. In the hallway, her parents stirred at the sound of her muffled cries. Even through 3 closed doors, the panic in her voice had carried. Her father was the first to react, leaping out of bed and rushing toward her room. Emma's mother followed close behind, her heart pounding with fear. When her father burst through the door, the scene before him was like something out of a nightmare. The man had his hand firmly over Emma's mouth, pinning her against the bed. Without hesitation, her father charged forward, his protective instincts taking over. The man barely had time to react before Emma's father delivered a powerful punch to his gut. The intruder doubled over with a grunt, releasing Emma, who scrambled backward on the bed, gasping for air. Her father didn't stop there, landing a second blow that sent the man sprawling to the floor. By the time Emma's mother entered the room, the fight was over. The man lay groaning on the floor, clutching his stomach. Emma's mother rushed to her daughter aside, pulling her into a tight embrace as she sobbed uncontrollably. Her father stood over the man, his chest heaving with adrenaline as he called the police. When the authorities arrived, they quickly restrained the intruder and searched him. Their discovery made Emma's parents' blood run cold. In the man's pocket were 2 pairs of Emma underwear, a chilling sign that this was not a random break-in. As the man was led away in handcuffs, Emma clung to her mother, her small body trembling with shock. The once cozy bedroom now felt like a place of nightmares, the storage door hanging ominously ajar. It would be a long time before Emma, or her family, could sleep soundly again. The storm outside was relentless, the kind that seemed to stretch the night into eternity. Rain lashed against the windows like an army of tiny fists, and the wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human. It was the kind of night that made you grateful for walls and a roof. Everyone in my family had settled into their usual routines, unfazed by the storm. My parents were in the living room, laughing at some sitcom canned humor, while my sister was upstairs, lost in her video games. As for me, I was tucked away in my room, sprawled out on my bed with the television murmuring softly in the background. I usually loved nights like this, the drumming of rain against the window pane, and the occasional low growl of thunder felt like a lullaby, soothing and protective. But that tranquility was shattered in an instant. A deafening bang on my window jolted me upright, my heart leaping into my throat. I froze, staring at the glass, unsure if I had imagined it. But then it came again. Monstrous, deliberate thud that sent vibrations through the frame. The storm blurred the outside world, streaking the window with rain. But as I squinted through the downpour, my stomach dropped. There was someone out there at first. The figure was indistinct, just a shadowy outline beyond the streaming water. Tell this story in a slow, dark, and scary tone. Vol.
Deste clo desperation against the glass. He raised his fists and pounded again, this time accompanied by muffled shouting. I could make out the words over the storm, but his urgency was unmistakable. Adrenaline surged as I hurried to the window, opening it just a crack. Cold rain sprayed my face, and his voice cut through the noise. Help me, please, let me in, he screamed, his words a frantic plea. His tone was raw, almost animalistic, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I could barely think. His soaked figure and wild eyes screamed danger, but his voice was filled with a kind of agony I could ignore. To the front door, I shouted back. Barely able to hear myself over the storm, I slammed the window shut before he could reply, hoping the solid barrier between us would calm the uneasy thudding in my chest. I bolted from my room, nearly skidding in my socks as I raced into the living room. My dad turned to me, startled, as I blurted out the words in a rush. Therein a guy outside. He looks hurt, screaming for help. My dad frowned, already rising from his seat. My mom, her face tight with concern, paused the television. Before we could say anything else, a pounding erupted at the front door, followed by the same desperate cries. Help me, please. Dad moved toward the door, his jaw set, but I grabbed his arm. Bubby, wait, I hissed, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked down at me confused, but I couldn't shake the gnawing unease that clung to my skin like the damp air outside. Something wasn't right. Then the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tension like a knife. On the television screen, the caller ID flashed. Mr. Porter, it was our neighbor from next door. Dad answered it, his voice steady despite the chaos. Hello. His expression changed almost immediately, the color draining from his face. No way, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He hung up quickly, turning to us with a look that made my stomach twist. Now stay away from the door, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. What in going on? Mom asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the window beside the door, lifting the curtain just enough to peek outside. His face tightened as he muttered. Keird crouched down, pounding on the door. What does he want? I whispered, dread curling in my stomach. Ed didn't look away from the window. Here and holding some, he said finally, his voice low and strained. A tool? No, it an axe. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Dad did wait another second. He raised his voice, shouting through the door, Get out of here! The cops are on their way! Pounding stopped. There was a long, agonizing pause. And for a moment, the only sound was the storm raging outside. Then, slowly, the shuffling of footsteps retreated into the night. Dad didn't waste a moment. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911, giving the dispatcher a full report while pacing the living room like a caged animal. After he hung up, he turned to us, his voice steady but tense. Mr. Porter saw him rummaging through his shed earlier, said he came out holding that axe. We sat in a tense silence, the storm outside feeling less like a comforting backdrop and more like a sinister accomplice. Minutes passed like hours until the flashing lights of a police car finally illuminated our windows. The officers swept the area, but found nothing at first. It wasn't until later that night that they apprehended the man, wandering the streets, with the axe still in his hand. The next morning, the events of the night felt surreal, like the fragmented pieces of a fever dream, but the local newspaper confirmed it. The man had a troubled history, and his intentions that night would remain forever unknown. All I knew was that we were lucky, and that I do never look at a stormy night the same way again. Working as the night janitor at the local high school was a job that most people would describe as uneventful.
It wasn't glamorous, but it was simple. Routine most of the time. I was the only one on the night shift. There wasn't really any need for more than one person after hours. My responsibilities were straightforward. Clean the downstairs classrooms first, then move upstairs to finish before my shift ended. The cafeteria, gym, auditorium, and nurse's office were left for the morning and afternoon crews, so my job was confined to the quiet, deserted classrooms. Lying alone in the school at night was something I'd grown used to, but it wasn't without its peculiarities. The silence could be oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the old building settling or the soft buzz of a fluorescent light. To make the hours pass more easily, I would bring a few radios with me, placing them in hallways to play music as I worked. The sound filled the empty space, giving the illusion of company and masking the eerie quiet. That meant how I was spending my night until everything changed. The upstairs of the school was shaped like a U, with two long hallways connected by a single corridor. To get to the other side, you had to traverse that narrow connection. I was mopping the floor of one of the social studies classrooms, the soothing rhythm of the radio keeping me focused, when something unusual caught my eye. Across the wide expanse of the hallway, at the farthest edge of the building, a light flickered on in one of the classrooms. My first thought was that I must have forgotten to turn it off, but I knew that wasn't right. I always turned the lights off in rooms I wasn't actively cleaning. This light had been left on, knee had been turned on. A cold, creeping sensation ran up my spine as I froze in place, my eyes locked on the brightly lit window. That end when I saw movement. Someone was walking across the room, their shadow framed by the fluorescent glow. My breath caught in my throat as they stopped abruptly at the window, staring out. No, staring straight at me. For a moment I couldn't move. My mop handle felt like an anchor in my hands, grounding me in place as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure did budge, their gaze fixed on me from across the vast stretch of darkened hallways. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a prank, a mistake, or something far worse? Summoning what little courage I could muster, I stepped closer to the window of my classroom, squinting to make out the figure and features. The closer I got, the clearer they became. Nay, man, likely in his 30s or 40s, with disheveled black hair. His face was partially obscured by the distance and the glare of the lights, but I could tell he was smiling. In fact, his expression was unreadable, which somehow made it even more unnerving. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, he slowly raised a hand and began to wave. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was deliberate, almost mocking. My breath quickened, and a deep sense of dread pooled in my stomach. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him, call the police, run? I made the split-second decision to pull down the blinds, blocking his gaze and giving myself a moment to think. My hands were shaking as I tried to steady my breathing, the reality of the situation sinking in. Who was he? How did he get into the building, and what did he want? I could not stand not knowing. Against my better judgment, I lifted the blinds again to check the window across the hall. The classroom was dark. The man was gone. Panic set in as my mind screamed one terrifying conclusion. He was on his way over to my side of the building. I had no way of knowing where he was or how much time I had before he reached me. The air felt suffocating, the walls of the school closing in as fear gripped me. There was no time to think anymore, only time to act. I dropped the mop, bolted out of the classroom, and sprinted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. My heart pounded in my chest as I tore through the lower halls and out the back door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the school, the equipment, or even my job. All that mattered was getting away. The next day, security footage revealed a horrifying truth. The man had emerged from the basement at some point during the night. He wandered the hallways, seemingly aimless, but his movements were deliberate enough to suggest he was searching for something. or someone. When the camera captured a close-up of his face, a shiver ran through me all over again. There was something profoundly unsettling about his appearance, something that made my skin crawl. But the most chilling discovery came later. The footage showed him returning to the basement, and that in where the trail ended. He never came back out. A thorough search of the basement revealed nothing. No sign of him. No hidden exits. No evidence of how he had disappeared. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I still work at the school, though every night feels like a test of courage I did sign up for. The basement haunts my thoughts, a black void of unanswered questions. Whatever I saw that night, whoever that man was, I can shake the feeling that he's still there, waiting. When I was 27, I moved into a small apartment with my girlfriend, Anna. It wasn't much, some modest place in an old building with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. Boo, it was ours. Neither of us were wealthy, so we were content with the simple space. It had potential, and we were ready to make it a home. Little did we know, our first night would reveal a dark, unsettling side to our new living situation. We were barely settled in when it began. The neighbors, or rather one neighbor in particular, the sound of yelling erupted from the apartment next door. It wasn't just raised voices, but guttural cries and frantic thumping that seemed to rattle the very walls. It was impossible to sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling while Anna tossed beside me. Her frustration eventually boiled over. "You need to go over there," she hissed, sitting up in bed. Her hair was messy, her eyes tired. "Tell them to stop." "This is insane." I groaned and promised her I would, but only if it happened again. It was our first night, and I hoped, prayed really, that it was a one-time occurrence. The next day, the building was eerily quiet. We spent hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and chatting about how we to decorate. The silence during the day was deceptive, lulling us into thinking the previous night. Pure chaos was behind us. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noise began again. This time, it was worse. The yelling was louder, more agitated, and the banging on the walls, can now seem deliberate, made the apartment tremble. At one point, something hit the shared wall with such force that Anna jumped. "Idiot," I said, sliding out of bed and throwing on a shirt. "I'm handling this." I marched to the neighbor door and knocked, firm but polite. It took a moment, but the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman. Her pale skin was almost luminescent under the dim hallway light. She had stark white hair that hung limply around her face, and her eyes were sharp and sunken. Her voice, when she spoke, was a harsh rasp, like she'd been smoking for decades. "What do you want?" she snapped, her tone immediately hostile. I tried to remain calm, polite even. "I'm sorry to bother you, but the noise has been really disruptive. My girlfriend and I are trying to sleep." And, "Mind your own biz," she barked, cutting me off. Without another word, she slammed the door in my face. When I returned to our apartment, the noises intensified, as if she was punishing us for daring to complain. Anna suggested reporting her to the building management, and though I was reluctant, I agreed. The next morning, I headed to the front desk. "The woman in the apartment next to ours is out of control." I told the doorman, "It sounds like there a whole group of people over there causing chaos every night. We can't sleep." The doorman frowned. "Which apartment?" When I told him, his confession deepened. "That Cassie Chim place." She alone. Her husband passed away years ago. It I just her. That can't be right, I insisted. There no way one person is making all that noise. He agreed to investigate and went to her apartment. To my surprise, Kathy let him in to search. When he returned, he looked baffled. Anjafurj. She alone, he said. No sign of anyone else. But I did warn her to keep it down. That night, the silence was almost unsettling. We were finally able to sleep, but I woke abruptly in the early hours of the morning. My chest felt heavy, and my instincts told me something was wrong. I glanced toward Anna, expecting to find her sleeping peacefully, but instead I saw a shadowed figure standing at the foot of the bed. My breath caught in my throat. "Anna," I whispered. She stirred beside me. A what? I froze. If Anna was next to me, who was at the end of the bed, you should have reported me. A raspy voice hissed. My blood ran cold. I scrambled for the lamp, my hands fumbling as Anna began to scream. When the light finally flickered on, the figure was gone. The space at the foot of the bed was empty. Panic overtook me. I threw on my robe and bolted into the hallway. Kathy Brent apartment door was ajar. Swaying slightly as if it had been pushed open moments earlier, I peered inside. The room was empty. No sign of Kathy. No sign of anyone. For a week, the apartment remained quiet. Kathy was gone. Her mailbox went untouched, and no one in the building seemed to know where. Sheik had disappeared too. Anna and I tried to put the experience behind us, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion. But then, one night, a new sound broke the silence. It wasn't yelling or thumping. It was 4 distinct knocks on the wall, deliberate and calculated. They weren't random noises. They were meant for us. As the knocking echoed through the room, Anna clutched my arm tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Den, we can't stay here," she whispered. I nodded, my own fear making it hard to think straight. The air in the apartment felt heavier, darker, as if something unseen had taken root. That night, we did sleep. Instead, we packed our belongings as quickly as we could, shoving clothes into bags and wrapping fragile items in towels. The fear of another encounter drove us to move with frantic urgency. By dawn, the apartment was nearly empty. We made multiple trips to the car, our eyes constantly darting toward Kathy Thane door, half expecting it to swing open. But the hallway remained silent. The only sound was the soft shuffle of our footsteps and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. As we carried the last box out, I turned to look at the apartment one final time. The door stood ajar, revealing the empty rooms that had once held so much promise. Now, they felt tainted, like a place that belonged to someone, or something else. We didn't look back as we drove away. Even now, years later, I can still hear those knocks in my mind, clear as day. I don't know what Kathy was, or if she was even human. All I know is that we were right to leave. And I will never forget the darkness that lingered in that apartment. A tiny memory that haunts me. A reminder that some places should simply be left alone. I've always preferred solitude when camping, truly getting away from it all. Not the campsites with picnic tables and neighboring tents just a shout away, but the kind of remote wilderness where a compass and a sturdy pair of boots are more useful than any cell signal. This particular trip was no exception. 2 years ago, I found myself camped on a prairie flat, a vast expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. Half of it was surrounded by a dense forest of ponderosa pine, their dark silhouettes sharp against the winter sky. The kind of remote place where you could yell at the top of your lungs and not a soul would hear you. My hound dog, Jake, was my only company. A big, loyal creature with a knack for wandering just far enough to make me nervous before circling back to my side. He always wore a bell clipped to his collar, a trusty little charm that jingled whenever he roamed, letting me know he was not too far off. It was cold that night, well below freezing. I had a fire roaring,
its flames hungrily consuming the logs and spitting warmth into the frosty air. Jake was doing his usual rounds, darting in and out of the firelight, disappearing into the darkness for a while, before returning for a scratch behind the ears or a spot by the fire. His bell was my constant reassurance, the faint jingling reminding me he was nearby, even when he was. Visible, I had settled into my camping routine, a cold beer in hand, music playing low, and the steady rhythm of chopping firewood to keep the blaze going. The stars above were sharp and bright, the kind of celestial display only visible miles away from civilization. I wasn't paying much attention to Jake's whereabouts. His bell would always let me know where he was. But then, about 20 minutes passed without the familiar jingle. I called his name, my voice breaking the otherwise perfect silence. Nothing. Turning down the music, I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. That e'en when I felt the first twinge of unease. After another few minutes of calling, I finally heard the faint familiar sound of the bell coming from behind me. Relief washed over me. But something was odd. The tree line was in front of me, where Jake had been sniffing around earlier. How had he circled around to my other side without me noticing? I brushed off the thought. Jake was a clever dog, always full of surprises. I returned my focus to splitting more firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe grounding me. Every so often I do catch the faint jingle of the bell behind me, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. It was comforting in its own way, the reassuring sound of my companion exploring the vast wilderness. But time slipped by, and I began to notice something strange. It had been almost 40 minutes since I'd last seen Jake. The jingling bell had gone silent. I called out again, this time with more urgency. The stillness that followed made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the inky darkness as I made my way toward the tree line. The forest loomed before me, an impenetrable wall of shadows and tall pines. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth, the light catching on gnarled branches and the occasional glint of frost. I called out again, my voice shaky now. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a movement. My unease deepened, morphing into a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, and then I heard it. A crunch, a subtle but distinct sound of something moving through the underbrush, sticks snapping. My mind raced. Could it be Jake, or was it something else? I backed away, retreating toward the safety of the fire and the shotgun resting near my truck. My pulse quickened as I scanned the tree line one last time before turning away. That tan when the silence shattered. A sound erupted from the forest. The bark, but not just any bark. It was Jacob's panic bark, a frantic, guttural noise that sent a chill down my spine. He was in distress, and it was coming from directly in front of me, from the tree line I'd just been watching. I barely had time to react before Jake burst into view, tearing across the field at full speed. The sheer panic in his movements was unmistakable. He didn't slow down as he barreled past me, diving straight under the truck, his safe haven. "Jake!" I shouted, dropping to my knees to check on him. His sides heaved, his breath coming in rapid bursts, but something was off. The bell on his collar, the one that had jingled so reliably, was gone. The carabiner that had held it was still intact, but the bell itself was missing. The realization hit me like a freight train. If Jake's bell was gone, what had I been hearing all that time behind me? The question lodged itself in my mind, heavy and unshakable. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I locked Jake and myself in the cab of the truck, shotgun within armor reach. The fire burned down to embers as the frozen night dragged on. Each creak of the forest amplified in the silence, and my thoughts spiraled with every gust of wind, every rustle in the dark. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. No idea what, who, had been wearing that bell, mimicking the sound of my dog, familiar jingle in the vast emptiness of the prairie. But one thing is certain, that night left a mark. A reminder of how thin the veil can be between the ordinary
and the inexplicable, especially when you're miles away from the rest of the world. I lived in a small college town, the kind of place where everything important seemed to fit into a compact area. My apartment complex was conveniently located within walking distance of the downtown strip, a bustling stretch of bars, cafes, and shops that came alive at night. The streets would hum with the chatter of students and the occasional distant laughter from one too many drinks. It was an ordinary weekday night when it all began, though it's done a memory that will stay with me forever. That evening, I found myself up late studying. The pile of assignments on my desk loomed large, and after hours of staring at my textbook, I needed a break. I grabbed my book, a pack of cigarettes, and stepped out onto the small, shared porch at the front of the building. The night was quiet, but for the occasional car passing and the faint echoes of downtown nightlife. The air was crisp and cool, enough to keep me awake as I lit a cigarette and settled onto the wooden stairs. A while later, movement caught my attention. A girl I vaguely recognized from the building next door stumbled into view. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair that swayed unsteadily as she walked. Egan never spoken to her before, but I knew she lived in the ground floor apartment just one over from mine. Judging by the way she moved, she'd clearly been drinking. She clutched a small purse and teetered slightly on her heels, struggling to fit her key into the lock. Finally, she managed to get the door open, slipping inside and letting it close behind her. I returned my focus to my book, letting the quiet settle around me again. But not even a minute later, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the street, startling me. A man, tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket, strode purposefully toward the girl indoor. I hadn't noticed him before, and his sudden appearance put me on edge. He reached her door and knocked firmly, the sound slicing through the stillness of the night. I sat up straighter, my textbook momentarily forgotten. It was well past 2:30 a.m., an odd hour for visitors, especially unannounced ones. From my vantage point on the stairs, I had a clear view of the girl-in apartment. She opened the door hesitantly, peering out with an expression that wavered between curiosity and caution. The man said something, and I watched as her posture relaxed slightly. They started talking. Though I could hear their words, the longer I observed, the more uneasy I became. The man's demeanor was off. Something about the way he moved felt calculated, almost predatory. He kept gesturing as he spoke, leaning slightly toward her. And then I saw it. He reached up and stroked her hair, not once but several times. She didn't recoil exactly, but her body language screamed discomfort. She shifted on her feet, glancing around as if looking for an escape. I decided to make my presence known. I turned the pages of my textbook noisily and coughed, letting them both know I was there. The man's-head turned slightly in my direction, but he did not acknowledge me. Instead, he stepped closer to her door. She tried to keep a polite smile, but I could see her grip on the door tightening as she subtly tried to keep it from opening further. The conversation dragged on for over 10 minutes, each passing second amplifying the tension. She seemed unsure of how to end it, her polite demeanor trapping her in an increasingly uncomfortable situation. I kept a close watch, ready to intervene if he tried to push his way inside. Finally, whether spooked by my presence or deciding he would get what he wanted, the man stepped back. Without a word, he disappeared into the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared. I exhaled the breath I had realized I was holding. The girl stood in her doorway for a moment, staring after him, before retreating into her apartment and locking the door. I stayed outside a little longer, just in case he came back. The next morning, I knocked on her door. She opened it with a wary expression that softened when she recognized me. We exchanged introductions, and I asked if she was okay after what had happened. She admitted how strange the encounter had been, describing how Shiga felt uneasy the whole time, but didn't know how to end a conversation without escalating things. Together, we decided to call the police. A few days later, we were asked to sit with a sketch artist to describe the man. As soon as the sketch was released to the public, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Calls flooded in, each one painting a darker picture of the man we had encountered. It turned out he was a serial predator, known for targeting women who left bars alone late at night. His usual tactic was to pose as a cab driver, offering rides to unsuspecting victims. The girl next door had only avoided becoming one of his victims because her apartment was close enough to the bars that he had the chance to use his usual ploy. The thought chilled me. That night could have ended very differently, if not for sheer luck and vigilance. The memory serves as a stark reminder. Sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real, and sometimes it die in the smallest actions, like staying outside a little longer, that can make all the difference. For years, my dad and I kept a cherished routine, camping deep in the forests of northern Michigan. Every Friday evening, we do pack our gear, load up the mountain bikes, and drive to my grandmother and lakefront house near Gaylord. From there, we do prepare for an adventurous weekend, venturing into the wilderness to find solitude and the raw beauty of nature. My grandmother and house, surrounded by towering pines and perched on the edge of a quiet lake, felt like a gateway to another world. By Saturday morning, we do strap on our rucks, pack enough supplies for a 3-day trip, and head to a state forest. Our destination was always the same, a forgotten 2-track road, overgrown with weeds, almost begging to be explored. We had no itinerary. The goal was simple: get lost in the woods, find a stream or river, and set up camp far away from anyone or anything. But one trip would forever change the way we viewed those peaceful, secluded woods. It started like any other weekend. After a short drive, we found a promising 2-track path. The road was choked with vegetation, the kind of trail that had seen a vehicle in decades. Perfect. We parked the truck, unloaded the bikes, and pedaled our way into the unknown, leaving civilization far behind Bow Butte. 8 miles in, we stumbled upon something unusual. It was an old stone foundation, the remnants of a building long gone, weathered and crumbling. The stones looked like they had been placed there by hand, each one roughly the size of a brick. Nearby, a small wooden shack stood no taller than 4 feet, weathered by time but remarkably intact. My dad, always curious, ducked inside. At 12 years old, I did need to duck, but hunched instinctively as I stepped in behind him. The interior was filled with relics from a bygone era: rustic gun barrels, fishing rods, wooden snowshoes, and battered cooking pots. Dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed for decades. To me, it felt like stepping into a hidden museum, an eerie glimpse into one life left behind. Dad examined everything with a mix of curiosity and caution, but we didn't linger too long. The place had a strange energy about it, as if the woods themselves were watching. We moved about 20 feet from the foundation and set up camp beside a babbling stream. Dinner that night was simple: bullfrogs we caught and pan-fried nachos, cooked on the Coleman stove. The night sky was breathtaking, a brilliant expanse of stars undimmed by city lights. It was moments like these that made me love camping. The sense of being completely immersed in nature, surrounded by its vast, untamed beauty. As the fire crackled and the woods darkened, we followed our usual nighttime routine. We hoisted our food bag high into a tree, tying it securely to a branch to keep it out of reach of wildlife. The air grew colder as we zipped up the tent, and I drifted off to the comforting sounds of the forest. The first sound woke me sometime after midnight. A deep, low grunt echoed from across the stream, muffled but unmistakable. My dad, an experienced hunter, whispered that it was likely a deer or elk. I trusted him, though the noise unsettled me. It wasn't long before the grunting turned strange. The deep, steady rhythm was broken by sharp, high-pitched cries, piercing sounds that almost resembled the wail of a child. It didn't sound like any animal I heard before. The noises came and went, fading into the distance before returning unexpectedly, each time closer than before. My dad, usually calm and composed, sat upright, his silhouette tense against the dim light of the lantern. He loaded his Remington and whispered for me to keep my 20-gauge shotgun ready. I nodded, gripping the gun tightly as the strange sounds continued. The forest, usually alive with insects and rustling leaves, seemed unnaturally still, as if holding its breath eternally. Exhaustion overtook us, and we fell into an uneasy sleep. Morning came with the warmth of sunlight filtering through the trees, but something was off. A rancid smell hung in the air, faint at first but growing stronger as we unzipped the tent. The odor was sour and putrid, like something rotting nearby. My dad muttered something about the wind carrying the scent of a carcass and went to check the food bag. I followed a few steps behind him, stopping when he froze in place. His voice, usually steady, dropped to a sharp whisper. "Now stay back." Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped around him and immediately wished I had. Hanging from the tree where we secured our food were 3 deer carcasses. They were suspended by vines wrapped around their legs, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Their heads had been removed and placed neatly on the ground below, each one positioned to face our tent. I felt my stomach twist as I took in the scene. The food bag we tied to the same branch was untouched, swaying gently just a few feet above the carcasses. My dad's voice cut through my growing panic. "Don't touch anything." He scoured the area, searching for tracks, blood, or any sign of how this could have happened. There was nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no broken branches. The vines themselves were a mystery. They didn't match anything growing nearby. We packed up camp in record time, our usual routine forgotten in the rush to leave. The walk back to the truck was eerily quiet. The usual forest sounds were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on us with every step. I could shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we finally reached the truck, relief washed over me. My dad wasted no time driving to the nearest Department of Natural Resources station to report what we'd seen. The ranger listened carefully, his expression darkening as my dad described the scene in detail. After a moment, he picked up the phone and made a brief call. "Another sighting near the stream," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. The way he said it in a quiet acceptance sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It was an isolated incident, and from the look on the ranger in face, it was something they could easily explain. Years have passed, but that trip still haunts me. My dad and I talk about it from time to time, trying to piece together the mystery, but the questions remain unanswered. Who, or what, was responsible? How could they have done it so silently, so cleanly, leaving no trace? And the vines, where did they come from? The forest keeps its secrets, and that day it showed us just how small and powerless we really are. Even now, when I venture into the woods, I can help but feel the weight of unseen eyes, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to cross their path. Some childhood memories linger not as fond recollections but as vivid echoes of fear, etched into your mind like a dark film over a glass lens. 2 such nights occurred within a block of my childhood home. Both unfolded while I was away from that home, innocently sleeping over at a friend place. To this day, I'm always the last one awake during get-togethers, a quirk that seems to grant me an unwelcome window into the strange and unsettling. The first incident happened when I was about 9 years old. It was a chilly autumn night, and I was staying at my friend's house. His room was on the second floor, and the view from his window looked out onto our quiet street, illuminated only by a single street lamp. That light bathed the asphalt below in a pale glow, casting eerie shadows onto the cracked pavement. It was late, well past midnight, and my friend was fast asleep, his soft snores the only sound in the room. I, however, was wide awake, lying on my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it, a scream that cut through the stillness like a blade. It wasn't just a scream of frustration or surprise. Z was blood-curdling, raw, and unrelenting, the kind of sound that seizes your heart and makes your breath catch. I bolted upright, every nerve in my body on edge. My gaze snapped to the window, and there, under the street lamp, I saw it. A shadowy figure stood motionless in the circle of light. At first glance, it seemed like a tall man, but its silhouette was grotesquely off. Its upper body was unnaturally broad, like it was wrapped in layers of bulk that weren't meant to be there. As I watched, it began to move, but not like any person should. Its feet stayed planted on the ground while its upper body writhed and twisted, as if it were fighting an invisible restraint, a straitjacket of darkness. The shadows that made up its form seemed to ripple unnaturally, like smoke caught in a windless void. I was frozen, my breath shallow as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. For a moment, I tore my gaze away to glance at my friend, hoping the noise had roused him. But no, slept on, oblivious. When I looked back at the street, the figure was gone, the screaming had stopped, the night was silent once more, yet the stillness didn't bring comfort. Instead, I was overwhelmed by the dreadful certainty that whatever it was, it had noticed me. Somehow, in the brief moments Edie'd been watching, it had turned its awareness on me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The second incident occurred a few years later, during another sleepover. I was 12 or 13 at the time, and this time we weren't confined to a bedroom, but camped out in a friend's backyard. He had a spacious yard, surrounded by a tall wooden privacy fence. The fence was sturdy, but its gate, located just outside his parents' room, was loud enough to wake the dead. Naturally, this meant we had to hop the fence if we wanted to sneak out, and of course, we wanted to. The plan was simple. Wait until everyone in the house was asleep, then climb over the fence and head out to explore the neighborhood. We had done it before, but that night felt different from the start. One of the kids in our group, usually the first to suggest breaking rules, said he just did feel right about it tonight. We teased him for being scared, accused him of chickening out, and decided to go without him. As we peeped over the top of the fence to make sure the coast was clear, something darted across the yard on the other side. At first, I thought it was a dog, but as the shape registered, my stomach dropped. It was not just a dog it could be. Its front limbs were massive, thick, and powerful, more like a gorilla arms than anything canine. Its head was disturbingly wrong, too, almost human in shape, but not quite. Its proportions were all off, like something that had never meant to exist. The way it moved froze us in place. Its limbs pumped in a chaotic rhythm, but its speed was terrifying, like it was chasing something, or someone. For a long moment, we were silent, our eyes darting between each other as if to confirm that everyone else had seen the same thing. When we finally spoke, the unease spilled out in fragmented whispers. That wasn't a dog, was it? No way. Its arms. Did you see its arms? We all agreed. It was no animal we had ever seen before. Something about its movements, its presence, felt wrong on a level I couldn't articulate. Fear took over any desire for mischief. We did climb the fence that night. We stayed in the tent, huddled together in uneasy silence until the first light of dawn. None of us wanted to admit how deeply the sight had shaken us, but none of us ever stayed at that friender house again. Not inside, not outside. To this day, I can't explain what I saw during those 2 nights. The shadow figure and the strange creature have remained vivid in my memory, bound by the chilling certainty that they were real, just as real as the house I grew up in or the quiet streets I once called home. And though I still find myself the last one awake at gatherings, I sometimes wonder if that more curse than habit. After all, some things are better left unseen. I used to work at a lot of conventions when I was about 20, traveling from town to town around the Delaware Valley and beyond. My manager lived in upstate Pennsylvania, where car, truck, and hunting shows seemed as abundant as the trees. His agency booked us gigs regularly, and I often stayed at his property during these weekends. It was a crisp Friday evening when I made the familiar drive upstate, my parents' dog Blue sitting stoically in the back seat. Blue was an 80-pound English shepherd, an alpha through and through. He didn't exactly obey me like clockwork, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. I was packed. If push came to shove, I knew he'd lay his life on the line to protect me. That weekend, I had no choice but to bring Blue along since my parents were out of town. After arriving at my manager house, I decided to stretch our legs before nightfall. The setting sun painted the woods in hues of amber and crimson, and the air was so still it felt almost sacred. Blue trotted beside me as we wandered down the quiet road that wound its way through the thick Pennsylvania woods. The serenity of the place was captivating. Nain far cry from the busier streets of my hometown as we walked. I noticed a faint clearing through the trees, bathed in the fading light. Curious, I veered off the road, leading Blue down an overgrown path toward it. The clearing was a quiet, almost dreamlike expanse, surrounded by tall grass that swayed gently in the evening breeze. It felt otherworldly, yet oddly inviting. Blue seemed to share my enthusiasm, sniffing at the ground and exploring with an energy that betrayed his usual aloof demeanor. But then, as if struck by an invisible force, he froze his head, snapped toward the far end of the clearing where the grass shifted unnaturally. At first it seemed like a breeze had caught the blades, but the motion was deliberate, calculated. Bluery body went rigid, his lips curling back to reveal teeth. Then came the growl, not the annoyed rumble he gave the mailman, but something deeper, primal. It was a sound I'd never heard from him before, one that sent a chill racing down my spine. I followed his gaze to the disturbance in the grass, now roughly 200 feet away. The height and breadth of the movement suggested something large, far too large for a fox or stray dog. My mind raced. A cougar? A wolf? Both possibilities seemed terrifying, but at least grounded in reality. Then, for one fleeting second, the thing moved into a sparse patch of grass, and I saw it. What I glimpsed was no cougar, no wolf. It was something out of a nightmare. The creature was mostly hairless, save for a ridge of bristling fur running down its spine. Its body was gaunt, but muscular, and its face, God, its face, had a hyena-like quality, savage and unnerving. My breath caught as I took in the shape of its legs. They were wrong, unlike any canine or predator I'd ever seen. The legs bent in unnatural ways, the feet pointed backward, and what should have been its knee joint bent forward instead. It moved with a bizarre yet fluid gait, pacing the clearing as if searching for something brow-deepened, a sound so fierce it seemed to reverberate in my chest. He was just alert. I was preparing for a fight. My hands trembled as I reached for his collar, trying to pull him away, but he wouldn't budge. His entire body was locked in place, his eyes fixed on the thing across the clearing. The creature didn't appear to notice us too engrossed in its foraging. It moved with a disturbing elegance, its shoulders rolling as it prowled through the grass. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might give us away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I could leave Blue. I tightened my grip on his scruff and whispered his name, trying to coax him out of his trance. It wasn't until the creature turned slightly, exposing more of its grotesque form, that I finally found the strength to act. I yanked Blue Wine collar hard, breaking his focus. He let out a low whine but allowed me to guide him backward, step by agonizing step. My eyes never left the creature, half expecting it to whip its head around and charge at us. But it didn't. It continued its strange, methodical movements, as if we didn't exist. Once we reached the edge of the clearing, I tightened my hold on Blue and broke into a brisk jog, my breath ragged and uneven. The woods, once serene, now felt oppressive, the shadows too dark, the silence too loud. Every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline coursing through me. Blue, for his part, didn't resist. He trotted beside me, his head low, ears pinned back. When we finally made it back to the road, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The clearing was far behind us now, obscured by trees. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. My mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. What had I just seen? Could it have been a large, mangy dog? A wolf with some kind of deformity? Edu worked in dog rescue for years, and had seen my share of genetic defects. But nothing like this. Nothing that could walk, let alone prowl. Back at my manager guest house, I locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, Blue lying protectively at my feet. I wanted to convince myself it was just an animal, something explainable. But deep down I knew better. The image of that creature, its grotesque legs, its unnervingly human-like movements, was burned into my memory. Even now, years later, I struggle to find a rational explanation. I've scoured forums, read about cryptids and strange wildlife, but nothing matches what I saw that night. Sometimes I tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of an overactive imagination, but Bluey reaction, the visceral terror in my otherwise fearless companion, tells me it was real, whatever it was, and I hope I never see it again. I would admit it. I've never liked Kathy. Not when I first met her, not now, and definitely not after everything I've seen. My dad started dating her a little over a year ago, and while I understand why he's been lonely ever since Mom passed in 2019, there is something about her that sets my teeth on edge. Her overly eager smile, the way her eyes seem to assess every corner of the house, and her uncanny ability to always be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dad and ready to settle down again, but against my better judgment, it seems Hare chosen Kathy, and I am terrified of what that choice might mean for my family. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Alex, and I have 2 younger brothers, Jake, who's 10, and Scotty, who just 2. In been the 3 of us, and Dad since Mom passed. We had our ups and downs, but for the most part we held it together. When Dad introduced Kathy to us, I immediately felt uneasy. Her smile was unnaturally wide, as if it were painted on, and she seemed to study us more than connect with us. At first, I thought I was being unfair. Maybe I was just protective of my family. But then, things started happening. Kathy began spending more and more time at our house, to the point where she practically lived here. A few weeks ago, I caught her in Dad's closet while he was out. The safe, where he keeps our important documents, and a few valuables is there, hidden behind a pile of old shoes. I was walking down the hall when I saw the closet door slightly ajar, and there she was, rummaging around like she owned the place. When she saw me, her face didn't change. She just smiled that unsettling smile and said, "Oh, hey, sweetie, need something?" Her voice was syrupy, but my stomach churned.
I forced out a "bye," and she shut the closet door before sauntering off as if nothing had happened. I told Dad about it that night, but he waved it off, saying she was probably just looking for a coat or something. I wasn't convinced. A few days later, I came home from school to find her leaving Jaker room. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stopped her on the stairs, my heart pounding. "What were you doing in Jaker room?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her smile did falter. "It is so stuffy in there." "I was just opening the window to let some air in," she said. It felt like a lie, but I didn't want to argue. I waited until she went downstairs before sneaking into Jaker room. Both windows were shut tight. I told Dad about it again, but his response was frustratingly familiar. "Alex, I know you don't like her, but give her a chance. She'd trying." I did bother telling Jake. I didn't want to scare him, but something about Kathy did sit right, and I could shake the feeling that she was up to something. 2 nights ago, everything escalated. Dad, Jake, and I were all out of the house, leaving Kathy to babysit Scotty. I came home earlier than planned, slipping in quietly because I wanted to see if I could catch her doing anything suspicious again. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard Scotty crying downstairs. Not the usual tired or hungry cries, but a distressed, desperate wail. Over his sobs, I heard Kathy's voice, loud and sharp. "Bush, shut up. Just shut up already." I froze. My chest tightened, and my hands clenched into fists. It was the first time I ever heard her lose her temper, and it sent a chill down my spine. Without thinking, I rushed downstairs and into the kitchen, where Scotty sat in his high chair, tears streaming down his face. Kathy stood over him, her face red with frustration. When she saw me, her expression shifted in an instant. The anger vanished, replaced by a blank, startled look. For once, she didn't give me her usual smile. She just muttered something under her breath and retreated to the basement, leaving me to comfort Scotty. I called Dad immediately. He promised to talk to her that night, but whatever they discussed, it did seem to help around to aim. I woke up to the sound of something shifting in my room. My heart raced as I opened my eyes and saw a shadow near the foot of my bed. Before I could react, the figure slipped out of my room and closed the door softly behind them. I jumped out of bed and yanked the door open, my pulse pounding in my ears. The hallway was dark, but I heard the faint sound of a door shutting. "Dad in room." I stormed down the hall, threw open his door, and found him asleep with Kathy lying beside him. "Dad, she was just in my room," I hissed, trying not to wake my brothers. Kathy sat up, her face a mask of confusion. "What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes cold. Dad looked between us, bleary-eyed and groggy. "Alex, it is the middle of the night. Go back to bed. We'll talk in the morn," he said. I wanted to scream. Instead, I turned and walked back to my room, my hands trembling. I heard them whispering behind their door as I shut mine. I barely slept the rest of the night, my mind racing with questions and fears. Why was she in my room? What was she looking for? And most importantly, how could I protect my family from someone I knew was dangerous when no one else seemed to see it? I don't know what to do, but I do know one thing. Kathy doesn't belong here, and until she gone, I do not think any of us are safe. It was a few years back, during a January that felt like it had been plucked from some sinister storybook. I was 30 then, and staying at my condo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The condo, nestled on the second floor of a modest yet respectable building, was my little retreat from the biting winters up north. Whenever I escaped to my Florida haven, I embraced the beach bum lifestyle. My remote job allowed me the freedom to work with just a laptop and phone, so I often took refuge there during the colder months. The city itself, a sunlit paradise for the most part, was as clean and safe as you could hope for, especially the area where my condo was located, at least that in what I believed. It was a late January night, the kind where even the breeze seems to whisper secrets. The clock had just ticked past 10 p.m., and I was out on my balcony, legs lazily draped over the railing, engrossed in work on my laptop. The soft murmur of waves in the distance was almost hypnotic, but my focus was abruptly shattered by a voice, loud and sharp, cutting through the stillness. "Yo, hey, you!" I paused, unsure if I was the intended target. Maybe someone was calling out to a friend or shouting at a passing car. But then came the follow-up, "Hey, you up there!" My pulse quickened. There was no mistaking it now. Whoever it was had fixed their sights on me. Setting my laptop aside, I leaned forward and peered over the railing. Below, in the dim glow of the parking lot lights, a man stood next to a car. His posture was casual, but there was something off, something uncomfortably deliberate about the way he looked up at me. "Yeah, you," he called again, a grin creeping across his face. "What'n up?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "Come down here. I want to show you something cool." The request was bizarre, the delivery unnerving. I squinted to get a better look at him. He wore a backward hat and a tank top, the kind of outfit you'd expect on a carefree beachgoer. But the way he stood, the tilt of his head, and that smile. "Didn't fit?" I hesitated, my gut screaming at me to stay put. "Nah, I'm good," I replied, trying to sound dismissive. His grin widened, but it twisted into something darker. Then, with a laugh that sent a chill up my spine, he said, "I'm gonna come up there and skin you alive. You prick." My blood ran cold. His voice carried a venom that turned the casual night air into something suffocating. I stood frozen for a moment, staring down at him. He was older than I had initially thought, maybe mid-30s or 40s, and there was no mistaking the malice in his expression. My mind raced. Should I shout back? Call for help? But something told me not to engage. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and stepped inside, sliding the door shut behind me with deliberate care. The glass provided a thin barrier, but it was enough to make me feel marginally safer for a while. Silence. I began to convince myself it was over, that he was just another intoxicated stranger with more bark than bite. But then came the sound, sharp and sudden. Bang. 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 Someone was pounding on my front door. My heart leapt into my throat as the pounding grew louder, more frantic. A voice accompanied it, shouting obscenities that made my skin crawl. It was him. The door shuddered under the force of his fists. "Open up, you coward," he roared, punctuating his words with threats that promised violence. I backed away, my mind a whirlwind of panic. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, hoping it would scare him off. It didn't. The pounding turned to scratching, no, carving, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against wood. He had a knife. Each second felt like an eternity. The scratching, the shouting, the relentless assault on my door. D was a symphony of terror. I stood there clutching my phone, too petrified to do anything but wait for it to stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, the noise ceased. A final deafening bang reverberated through the condo, followed by one last curse hurled my way. Then, silence. I crept to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. He was gone. I exhaled a shaky breath and dialed the police. When they arrived, I showed them the damage. It's a series of deep gouges in the wood, each a grim reminder of the knife he had wielded. "This guy was seared," one officer muttered as he examined the marks. Serious, indeed. I stayed up the rest of the night, my ears attuned to every creak, every rustle. The man had returned, and the police assured me they'd patrol the area, but sleep was out of the question. New this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just a stranger, high and unhinged, roaming the streets in search of chaos.
Or maybe I had unknowingly crossed paths with someone truly dangerous either way. That night taught me a lesson I will never forget. Even in paradise, the shadows can hide nightmares. Therein, a peculiar weight that comes with the phrase, "I spent a night in jail." It evokes images of hardened criminals and bad decisions, but for me, it was something far more surreal and far less deserved. Let me be clear, I didn't do anything wrong. It all began at a nightclub in my hometown, a place I'd only gone to because some friends insisted. The dim lights, pulsating music, and press of bodies weren't exactly my scene, but with enough drinks in my system, I figured I could endure it. That, when I saw her, Eve, the one who, let's just say, had a knack for drama, she did confront me directly. No, that would have been too straightforward. Instead, she whispered a lie into the ear of one of the bouncers, accusing me of inappropriate behavior toward her and her friends. I hadn't even spoken a word to her, let alone approached her, but the accusation was enough. A towering bouncer stormed toward me, his face a mask of hostility. Before I could even protest, he grabbed me by the arm and began shoving me toward the exit. My drunken mind reacted instinctively. I pushed back, a clumsy attempt to assert my innocence, but it was a mistake. Outside, the night air was cool, but my temper was burning. Unfortunately, the situation took a turn for the worse when two police officers, stationed conveniently near the club, decided to intervene. Between a stumbling drunk patron and a bouncer in uniform, who do you think they believed? Handcuffs clicked around my wrists, and before I knew it, I was in the back of a squad car, my pleas for reason falling on deaf ears. The jail cell was as grim as you do imagine. A wooden bench was the only seating option, and the air was thick with the scent of despair. But what truly made my skin crawl was my cellmate. He was a man who looked like he could live through his own personal war zone. Tattoos etched deep into his face, a front tooth missing, and eyes that carried a dangerous glint. His presence screamed, "Don't mess with me." "Why are you in here?" he asked, his voice gravelly and probing. "For something I didn't do," I muttered. The bouncer said I attacked him. He chuckled, a low, sinister sound. "Yeah, sure. That and what they all say. I was sure whether to stay silent or keep talking. If I ignored him, would it provoke him? If I answered, would I say something that offended him? In my haze of drunkenness and exhaustion, I chose the latter. I vented, partly out of frustration, partly out of a desperate need to keep him at bay. I told him everything, how my parents were out of town, how my friends and I had pre-gamed at my house, and how the night spiraled out of control. I even let slip the area I lived in, nicer part of town, the kind of place where people lock their doors more out of habit than necessity. I was thinking clearly, and by the time he stopped asking questions, I was too drained to realize just how much as you said morning came, and with it a grim procession to court. My cellmate and I were shuffled into the same courtroom. Though I appeared before the judge first, I could feel his eyes on me as the charges were read aloud. Assault and trespassing. Both were ludicrous, but there they were, hanging over me like a storm cloud. The judge released me with a future court date, and I walked out of the courtroom feeling hollow. But as I left, I noticed my cellmate sitting at the back, his gaze steady and unnervingly thoughtful. That night, back at home, I tried to push the whole ordeal out of my mind. My parents were still away, and the house felt unusually quiet. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, hoping it would clear my head. Instead, what I heard made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Multiple sets of them, circling the house. My heart pounded as I crept through the darkened rooms, shutting windows one by one. When I reached the sliding glass door that led to the deck, I hesitated. Curiosity won over caution, and I flicked on the deck light. Two figures bolted into the shadows, their silhouettes sharp against the night. One of them glanced back just long enough for me to recognize him. He was my cellmate. Panic gripped me as I yanked the blinds shut and locked the door. My mind raced, piecing together how Hugo found me. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He must have overheard my name in court, done a quick online search, and connected the dots. The details they foolishly shared in that cell had painted a target on my back. For the rest of the night, I listened intently, every creak of the house and rustle of the wind setting my nerves on edge. But the footsteps didn't return. In the days that followed, I kept the incident to myself. I didn't tell my parents about the jail, the cellmate, or the near break-in. The weight of it all sat heavy on my shoulders. A reminder of how one night of bad luck and worse decisions had turned my world upside down. I did not do anything wrong that night, but in some ways, I'm still paying for it. This is something that just happened to me, and I still don't know how to feel about it. Honestly, I'm freaked out. I would call myself spiritual. Far from it. I've always been more of a realist, grounded in facts and logic, but recent events have shaken my perspective. For context, I've been seeing this guy named Spencer. We met through a coworker on a night out at a bar. Spencer and charm was undeniable. He had this easy confidence that drew me in. Over time, we started seeing each other more frequently, though it wasn't always smooth sailing. Eventually, I introduced him to my family. My parents didn't seem to have strong opinions about him, which I found surprising given how protective they've always been. My grandparents, however, weren't shy about their feelings from the start. They didn't care for Spencer. My grandma, in particular, was vocal about it. She said he had a bad energy about him, something dark lurking beneath his surface. She didn't trust him, and her words began to echo in my mind. At first, I dismissed their concerns, chalking it up to generational differences or their overly cautious nature. But as time went on, I began to see what they meant. Spencer's temper was quick to ignite. We argued constantly, the kind of arguments that left you drained and questioning everything. One night, during a heated exchange, I felt an almost tangible tension. In a moment where I thought he might raise his hand, he did. But the restraint in his demeanor scared me. That was when I decided I was done. Or at least, I thought I was. When I told my grandma about ending things with Spencer, she was visibly relieved. She hugged me tight and said I deserved so much better, even jokingly suggesting I find a nice Italian boy from a respectable family. That was her thing, always trying to nudge me in a direction she thought was best. Her words stayed with me, her unwavering love and support a constant in my life. But not long after, she passed away from a heart attack. The loss was crushing, and I felt untethered. In her memory, I hung a picture of her in my room, a small token to keep her close. It felt like a way to honor her, to have her watching over me. That picture became a source of comfort in an otherwise dark time. About a month later, I was still reeling from grief and a string of bad days when Spencer reached out. Weak and yearning for familiarity, I answered. It started with a simple conversation, but before I knew it, we were seeing each other again. To my surprise, it was different this time. For 2 weeks, we didn't argue once. He seemed calmer, more patient. For the first time in ages, I felt safe around him. Against my better judgment, I allowed myself to hope that he had changed. A few nights ago, we made it official. Spencer was now my boyfriend again. That night, I fell asleep, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and optimism. But in the dead of night, I woke to a sharp crash. Heart pounding, I flicked on the lamp, scanning the room for the source of the noise. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but then I saw it. The picture of my grandma had fallen from the wall. The frame lay on the floor, shattered. I froze. My breath hitched as I stared at the broken glass. The silence in the room was deafening. There had been no draft, no disturbance that could have caused it to fall. My hands trembled as I picked up the frame. The image of my grandma smiled back at me, but something about the moment felt heavy, oppressive. My mind raced. Could it be a sign, a warning? The next day, I called Spencer. My voice shook as I told him I needed space, that we should go our separate ways for a while. I said my head wasn't in the right place, but the truth was deeper than that. The shattered frame haunted me, my grandma's earlier words echoing louder than ever. You're not a good guy. Spencer's reaction was exactly what I feared. He blew up, his temper flaring on the other end of the line. His anger validated everything my grandma had said, everything I had felt, but tried to suppress. The conversation ended abruptly, leaving me shaken but resolute. Even now, I can explain what happened. I've gone over it in my head 100 times, trying to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation for why that picture fell, but no matter how hard I try, I'm left with the same unsettling thought. What if it was her? What if my grandma, in some way beyond comprehension, was trying to protect me? I'm not sure I'd ever have the answer. But one thing is certain. I can ignore the feeling that something greater was at play, and that thought, as comforting as it might seem, is also deeply terrifying. It seemed like a wake-up call to my lost ways. The idea of taking my Jeep on a road trip to Colorado had been lingering in my mind for months. There is something uniquely exhilarating about venturing deep into the wilderness where the world feels untouched, raw and wild. Colorado way rugged trails, particularly those around Red Feather Lakes, were the perfect challenge. The crown jewel of my planned route was the Dead Man Road Trail, notorious among off-road enthusiasts for its tricky terrain and haunting name. To me, it was perfect, isolated and demanding, with scenery that could stop your heart. I arrived at the trail just before dusk, the sky a watercolor of amber and mauve as the sun dipped behind the towering pines. My Jeep grumbled confidently over the rocky path, its tires biting into the dirt. I planned to camp for the night, using my trusty Jeep as both shelter and sanctuary. With the back seats folded down and my sleeping bag unfurled, I had everything I needed for a solo night under the stars. I've always found solace in solitude. Some call it strange, but I see it as liberating. The Jeep came to a halt at a quiet clearing just off the main trail. The location was strategic, close enough to the path for convenience, but tucked away to ensure privacy. Not that I expected company. Few dared to tread Dead Man Road at night, and that was just the way I liked it. After a modest dinner of protein, bars, and snacks, I prepared for bed. The LED light bar on my Jeep illuminated the dense forest around me, casting long shadows that danced with every rustle of the wind. Despite the ruggedness of the setup, there was a sense of calm in knowing I was alone out here. The thick, suffocating quiet of the wilderness was punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional creak of trees swaying in the night breeze. As I slid into my sleeping bag, the world outside felt distant, the kind of isolation that both peaceful and unnervingly vulnerable. The Jeep windows were tightly shut to keep the bugs at bay, but even then I could hear every sound the forest offered. It was a lullaby of nature that soon began to soothe me into a light doze, and then I heard it a voice. It was faint, almost carried by the wind, but unmistakably human. My eyes snapped open, and my breath caught in my throat. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. The voice came again, clearer this time, accompanied by a burst of short, high-pitched laughter. My stomach twisted. The sheer darkness of the trail made it impossible for someone to wander here on foot, especially without a flashlight or a vehicle. Yet the voice persisted, weaving its way through the trees like a sinister melody. My pulse quickened. I sat up slightly, peering through the windows in search of headlights
or taillights, any sign of another person. There was nothing but the oppressive blackness of the forest. Then the voice came again, closer this time, sharp and almost playful. I could tell if it belonged to a woman or a young boy, but it sent icy chills racing down my spine. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized someone was indeed out there. I clung to the thin hope that it was a figment of my imagination, a trick of the wind. For several long minutes the forest returned to its usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves. My heartbeat began to steady, and I allowed myself a sliver of relief. Maybe it was nothing. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife, a voice called out clearly, "Hello, I see you there." My blood turned to ice. The voice was close now, too close. I froze, fear rooting me to the spot. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to move, to slide into the driver's seat and flee. But I was paralyzed. My mind clung to the irrational belief that if I stayed still, I could somehow become invisible, that the darkness would shield me from whoever was out there. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the silence now suffocating. Then came the banged, sharp, deafening thud on the rear windshield. I jolted upright, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Instinct took over as I scrambled over the seats, throwing myself into the driver-in position. My trembling hands fumbled with the keys, and the Jeep roared to life with a lurch. I accelerated down the trail, the tires slipping and bouncing over the jagged terrain. The headlights carved a path through the dense trees, but I could bring myself to look in the rear-view mirror. I didn't want to see what might be chasing me. Every bump and jolt of the trail felt like a lifetime. The eerie laughter echoing in my ears long after it had stopped edgewally. The dirt gave way to asphalt, and I did stop driving until I reached the dimly lit parking lot of a roadside motel. The adrenaline began to subside, leaving me shaky and drained. I parked the Jeep and sat in the silence, trying to piece together what had just happened. Some people later asked if it could have been someone in distress, maybe a stranded hiker or a camper in need of help. But no, stranded hikers don't laugh in the darkness without a flashlight. Stranded hikers don't knock on windshields in the dead of night. Whoever was out there was looking for help. They were looking to scare me. Worse. Some moments in life defy explanation. Events that linger like shadows in the corners of your memory, refusing to fade. This is one of those moments, one I can never forget. I was upstairs in my room, surrounded by scattered notes and half-written paragraphs, as I worked on a paper for my history class. The faint hum of my desk lamp and the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard filled the room, a kind of comforting monotony. As far as I knew, I was home, alone, lost in my thoughts, shaping arguments and drawing conclusions. Then it happened. A voice called out from downstairs. My mother voice. It startled me, not because she called my name, she often did, but because I had heard her come home. "What?" I shouted back, annoyed at the interruption. No response. I sighed, my irritation bubbling over. I didn't want to lose my train of thought, but curiosity gnawed at me. Why would she answer? Reluctantly, I pushed back my chair and headed downstairs, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. The house seemed eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I looked around the living room and kitchen, calling out, Mom." Her voice came again, sharper this time, calling my name. It was coming from the basement. Something felt off. I walked to the basement door, my footsteps growing hesitant. The door was slightly ajar.
The black void beyond it uninviting. I flicked the switch, but the light didn't come on. A lump formed in my throat as I called out, Mom, what are you doing down there with the lights off?
No answer. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing the flashlight. We kept on the kitchen counter, flicking it on. I cast its beam into the darkness. Slowly, cautiously, I descended the creaky stairs. Her voice called my name again. It was uncanny. Every syllable, every intonation was identical to the last time she said it. It did not sound natural. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and run, but I kept going, the flashlight trembling in my hand. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I swept the beam of light across the basement. The shadows danced and shifted, but there was no sign of her. Mama, I called again, my voice shaky. No response. That sheen, when I noticed it, near crawl space door. It was wide open. We called it a closet, but it was more like a small cavern you had to crawl into. The space extended deep into the basement, a dark and narrow place that always gave me the creeps. I stared at the opening, heart pounding. Mom, I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. The quiet hum of the basement light filled the air, a sound that somehow made the silence even louder. I knelt by the crawl space, shining the flashlight into the blackness. The beam of light didn't reach far, swallowed by the oppressive darkness inside. Are you messing with me? I asked, my voice shaking. Still nothing. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I could name. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I lingered for one long, agonizing moment. Then, as if some unseen force jolted me into action, I bolted. I sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and slammed the basement door behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock, my breathing ragged. For a moment I just stood there, trembling, the door a fragile barrier between me and whatever was down there. Desperate for answers, I grabbed the house phone and dialed my mom in cell. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped it. The dial tone rang in my ear, each beep stretching into eternity until finally she picked up. Mom, I blurted out, my voice trembling. Her cheerful voice greeted me from the other end of the line. Hey, sweetie, what up? Are you at the store? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Yeah, just picking up a few things. Why? I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a panic rush. She did believe me, of course. Who would? She thought I was pulling some kind of elaborate prank. It wasn't until she came home along with my dad that we went into the basement together. I stayed close to them, clutching the back of my dad's shirt as he walked down the stairs. The crawl space door was still open. My dad crouched and peered inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He crawled in, his movements deliberate and cautious. Moments later he emerged, brushing dust off his hands. There's nothing in there, he said, his tone calm but firm. But I knew what I'd heard. I wasn't imagining it. There was a brief chapter of my life when I lived entirely on my own. It was a strange transitional period, freshly moved out of my parents' house, stepping tentatively into independence. It was before I met my girlfriend, who would later fill my days with warmth and companionship. Back then, it was just me in a small, one-bedroom apartment tucked away in the downstairs of someone else's house. The apartment was modest, but functional, with creaky floors and narrow hallways. Its charm was limited, but it suited my needs. It's funny how such a place can seem so different in the light of day versus the quiet, solitary hours of the night. By day, it was just an apartment. By night, it became something else entirely. I spent most of my free time alone, except for school or work. I didn't mind the solitude too much. It gave me a chance to indulge in one of my favorite pastimes, watching movies, horror movies, to be specific. I loved the thrill, the suspense, the way a well-crafted scare could send shivers down my spine, even at 21, though I wasn't immune to the lingering unease they left behind. The echoes of terror would stay with me, following me into the stillness of my bedroom. On those nights, I do sometimes find myself lying awake, staring into the darkness. My eyes would scan the room, every shadow and corner suddenly alive with sinister possibilities. Occasionally, Iju reach over and flick on the bedside lamp, just to reassure myself that nothing was there. One particular night stands out vividly in my memory. I had just finished watching a movie that had really gotten under my skin, the kind of film that makes you question every creak and groan of the house. The upstairs tenant, whose footsteps I do often hear above me, wasn't at home that night. His car was missing from the driveway, and the apartment above was unnervingly silent. As I lay in bed, trying to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind, I began to notice faint noises. At first, they were subtle, like the soft rustling of fabric or the faintest tap of something against wood. My ears strained to pinpoint their origin, but the sound seemed to move elusive and untraceable. The longer I listened, the more it began to gnaw at me, my nerves unraveling with every passing second. Finally, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. Heart pounding, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My room felt oppressively quiet, as though it were holding its breath alongside me. Slowly I crept to the door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the narrow hallway. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the pale glow of moonlight, filtering in through the living room windows at the far end. The silence was deafening. I stepped out cautiously, my bare feet making almost no sound against the cold floor. My eyes darted to the bathroom door on my right, then to the open space of the living room and kitchen ahead, and that when I saw her at the far end of the hallway, silhouetted against the faint light, stood a woman. Her presence was both startling and surreal, as though she had been plucked straight from the horror movie Ida just watched. She stood motionless, facing me, her features obscured by shadow, but her intent gaze unmistakable. Time seemed to freeze. My breath caught in my throat, and my body locked in place. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but all I could manage was to stand there staring back at her. Then, in a movement that defied every instinct of normalcy, she began to step backward, retreating into the shadows while still facing me. It was deliberate, slow, and utterly unnerving. That was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. A scream tore from my throat as I stumbled back into my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. My heart was pounding so violently that I could hear it in my ears. I stood there, back pressed against the door, waiting for her to try to force her way in. But she did. Instead, I heard the rapid thudding of footsteps ascending the half-flight of stairs that led to the apartment exit. A moment later, the door above slammed shut, and silence fell once more. I stayed in that room for what felt like an eternity, clutching my phone and staring at the door as though it might burst open at any second. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the room, my hand still shook as I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was quiet and empty, just as it had been before. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot. There was no sign of her. After locking the door to the apartment, I sat on the couch trying to piece together what had just happened. Who was she? How had she gotten in? And most hauntingly, what did she want?
Despite the torrent of questions, I could bring myself to call the police to this day. I'm not sure why. The next morning, I called my landlord to report the incident. He listened quietly, then assured me he'd look into it. A few hours later, he called me back, his tone more serious than before. What he told me sent chills down my spine. The woman, he explained, was an ex-girlfriend of the upstairs tenant, Nad, volatile and unstable figure from his past. Somehow, she had tracked him down and broken into the house, only to mistakenly enter my apartment instead of his. The landlord assured me she had left the area and would be coming back. Later that day, the upstairs tenant himself came to my door to apologize, though he offered little detail about the woman or their history. Even now, I'm haunted by the memory of that night. The image of her standing at the end of the hallway watching me with an intensity that felt almost inhuman is seared into my mind. I can help but wonder what she had planned, and what might have happened if she had found the person she was looking for instead of me. The day began like any other. My wife was out running errands, and I decided to catch up on some much-needed rest. The house was quieter than usual, save for the sporadic noises that came from my kids. My eldest, a 15-year-old with a boundless energy for adventure, had been in and out of the house all day, as was typical of him. The constant opening and closing of the front door had become background noise to me, a rhythm I barely noticed anymore. I lay sprawled on my bed, basking in the stillness of my room. But soon the tranquility was disrupted. The storm door slammed shut with such force that it rattled the walls. I flinched, irritation flickering in my chest. How many times is he going to slam that door? I muttered to myself. Whistling sharply, I called out, "Hey, keep it down!" The noise subsided briefly, but it wasn't long before a new sound caught my attention. This time, it came from across the hallway, from the direction of Keith's room. Keith, my 10-year-old, had a penchant for creating chaos in the form of imaginative play. I assumed he was diving headfirst into one of his wrestling matches, his toys clashing in mock battles, but the sound grew louder, a repetitive, unrelenting thumping that made my chest tighten, even with my door shut. It reverberated through the house. My annoyance turned to unease. What on earth was Keith doing? I swung my legs off the bed, padding across the hallway to Keith's room. The noise became sharper, more distinct. It wasn't the playful cacophony of a child immersed in a game. It was heavier, almost ominous, a dull, rhythmic thudding against the wall. The door to Keith's room was ajar, and the scene that greeted me made my blood run cold. There, standing in the corner, was a man, and a grown man. His forehead was pressed against the wall, and with a disturbing mechanical precision, he was banging his head against it. Each impact left a smear of red on the paint, a grotesque pattern of fresh blood. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. "Keith!" I called out, my voice trembling with both anger and fear, but my son was nowhere in sight. The man didn't turn around completely. Instead, his head twisted slightly, just enough for me to catch the glint of his eyes. They were wild, unfocused, yet oddly aware. His face twisted into a sinister smile that sent a chill crawling down my spine. Instinct took over. Before I could think, I lunged at him, tackling him to the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of both of us, but adrenaline surged through me. As I held him down, I caught a movement from the corner of my eye. Keith, he had been hiding under his blanket, curled into a tight ball on his bed. His terrified eyes peeked out from beneath the covers. "Keith, get the phone now," I barked, not daring to loosen my grip on the man. Keith hesitated for a moment, his small frame frozen in fear. But then he scrambled off the bed and bolted out of the room. The stranger beneath me began to writhe, but his resistance was feeble. Instead of fighting back, he laughed, a low, guttural sound that rose to an unhinged cackle. He muttered incoherent phrases, a string of psychotic gibberish that sent shivers through me. His words were nonsense, yet they carried an eerie weight, as if they held some dark secret I could comprehend. Minutes felt like hours. I held him down with all my strength, my heart pounding in my chest. Keith returned with the house phone, his hands trembling as he passed it to me. I managed to dial the police, my voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around me. "They're on their way," I told Keith, who nodded silently and retreated to the far corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. The man didn't stop. He continued to grin, his teeth stained with blood, his laugh echoing off the walls. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice suddenly lucid, before descending back into incoherence. I tightened my grip, praying the police would arrive soon. When the officers finally burst through the door, relief washed over me. They quickly restrained the man, who offered no real resistance, still chuckling to himself as they dragged him away. I slumped against the wall, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The aftermath was a blur. The officers reassured me that the man would be taken into custody and evaluated. "You're not well," one of them said gently, "probably a combination of mental illness and substance abuse." I nodded, too drained to respond. Keith clung to my side, his small hands gripping my shirt as though afraid he'd disappear. I chose not to press charges. It was clear the man needed help more than punishment. As the officers escorted him out, he glanced over his shoulder, his wild eyes meeting mine one last time. And then he was gone. That night I sat in the living room with Keith beside me. My eldest son returned home wide-eyed and apologetic when I recounted what had happened. My wife, visibly shaken, embraced us all tightly when she walked through the door. It had been weeks since that day, but the memory lingers. Sometimes, when the house is too quiet, I hear the phantom thud of that Manon head against the wall. I check the locks more often now, and every night I remind my children how much I love them. Because in a world as unpredictable as ours, safety is never guaranteed.